One day the world changed dramatically from the opened gates. Terrible and terrifying monsters began to crawl out, reaching out with their hands from the abyss in the ground. But there were also those people who were able to obtain certain powers and become stronger than an ordinary person. These people had abilities. They began to be called hunters. They rushed into battle with those individuals that emerged from the depths of the earth. People stood waiting for the hunters, whispering, because not everyone managed to get through the dungeon and return. Finally, the black-haired man pointed his finger at the open portal and shouted that someone was coming out. Everyone stared there. First, a sharp blade appeared, then a foot in a white sneaker, and only then did the body begin to appear. The people were rejoicing, and the gates were already closing. But the one who came out from there was hunched over, as if the weight of the years he had lived was pressing down on him. Hunter Jean announced that the dungeon was protected, and there were no more monsters there. He was famous for being able to clear a dungeon that was difficult to enter at the age of 60. One day this man disappeared, simply evaporated like air. But 10 years later he reappeared. The nurse in the blue uniform put his hands on his hips and laughed at this statement that he was a great hunter. The man walked up to the other guy and exhaled in frustration. It started again, and the old man sat on the bed and waved his hands furiously. The guys turned to him, and he repeated the same thing over and over again, that he was Jean, a great hunter. The young men decided that it was just a joke, laughed, and considered this man a swindler who had deceived people in the past. Laughing, they wanted to finish quickly and go home, but suddenly the guy with glasses grabbed their hand and looked away. Suddenly the guy ran up frightened, asking what had happened to the man, who was crouching on his feet. There was a deafening scream, and the man turned around and saw a huge cockroach behind him. The red-haired man was held by the neck by a claw, trying to pry it away with both hands, begging to be saved. The boy's wide-open eyes stared without looking away. Drops of blood splashed onto his face. The young man's mouth opened in a silent scream when he saw that his comrade's head was already lying nearby. He huddled against the wall in fear, waving his hands and screaming for them not to touch him. Fear and panic all mixed up. Salvation came from where no one expected it. The old man jumped on the cockroach and cut it across with a knife. The nurse, who was stunned by this turn of events, painted his body red with blood. Jean looked at the boy and said that they needed to run immediately and not sit and waste time. Grandpa straightened up, looked to the side, gave orders to the young man as if he always did so, and most importantly, they listened to him. Jean looked back at the guy who was worried and asked him what he would do on his own. He turned away from him, closed his eyes and snapped, "He will do what he always did. What he must do." Stepping over the dead cockroach, the man moved on. The discouraged young man remained standing and was speechless. Only now I realized that all this was true. All the stories that my grandfather told before were true, and he really was the hunter Jean. More and more huge, terrible insects emerged from the portal, rushing to attack. Looking at these monsters, he didn't understand what the association that was supposed to protect people was doing. Suddenly, the insects saw the man who was watching them. They raised their antennae upward, and a disgusting sound came out of their throats. Jean straightened up. He saw that they had noticed him, which meant it was time for a warm-up. He furiously rushed into the attack, stabbing the first monster in the head, twisting a hole in it. He squinted and noticed that the second one was also attacking him with its mouth open. He jumped on him and actively chopped down the monsters, doing so deftly and cheerfully. Despite his age, he shouted angrily, "You need to kill everyone so that everyone gets what they deserve. You have to defend your place." The man's knife began to glow in his hands, and thanks to this power, he began to chop up the monsters more and more actively. After defeating everyone, the man stood up, raised his head, and looked into the distance. Something was approaching. Jean came to the disappointing conclusion that he had really gotten old. It was already hard to fight with several beetles. He was out of breath. The hero was glued together. He saw in front of him the leader of these beetles, a terrible one, who was looking at him. A huge green grasshopper made piercing sounds and towered over the character. He parried the man's blow. The grasshopper threw him into a stone, hit his back, and the air rushed out of his lungs. The grasshopper stood and watched, making sounds, while the man exhaled and leaned weakly against the stone. The main character pressed his back against the stone and did not raise his eyes. After all, age was taking its toll on him. There was no strength left to do anything. Bringing his mustachioed face closer and closer to him, the man exhaled sharply. Opening one eye, he didn't like the fact that they were poking a dirty snout at him. He dropped his hands, which held the knife, and hit the very face of the monster, who had not even expected such a thing. The grasshopper raised and shook his head, throwing the man into a tree, and he hit his back again, driving the knife harder and harder into the head. While already riding the monster, the man tried with all his might to correct the situation. The hero's face was all covered in blood. He opened one eye and exhaled, finishing. Suddenly, strength came from somewhere. My eyes sparkled blue. I decided to finish this now. Jean dealt the fatal blow. Behind him, the grasshopper writhed in agony behind the guy, throwing its muzzle up. Finally, the grasshopper fell down dead with a split head, and the man was sitting on his knees. He smiled, turned his head and looked at the monster. The great hunter was still alive. The man immediately fell to the ground with his hands stretched out in front of him. He no longer had any strength. He tried to raise his head, but his decrepit body no longer obeyed, and then he realized that this was his end. The portal opened, and the man prayed that if he were younger, he could handle everyone, adding sadly that he couldn't be a good hunter all this time. A speech came from the portal, announcing that the dungeon was protected, and congratulating them on it. The same voice announced that a special reward would be given as a reward, reflecting the subject's desire. The man had never heard anything like this before. People's voices were heard. Everything started spinning, but the grandfather didn't see it. When someone tried to call the man to open his eyes, calling him a patient, he sat up on his couch and heard that he was in the hospital because he had been badly injured during the rampage in the dungeon, and the nurse explained all this to him. When conducting a survey, it was necessary to find out when the character was born. A couple of questions and an answer was required. The man scratched his ear with his finger and began to get angry. He had already repeated his year of birth several times and stared angrily at the nurse. The young girl cried out in surprise. He couldn't be 83 years old. A smile splashed in his wide-open eyes. He exhaled with displeasure, angrily noted that he had already spoken, and more than once, narrowed his eyes. He had poor hearing. Apparently he had come to a conclusion. He chuckled, tucked his chin in his hand, showed off. He looks much younger. The girl sweated. Beads of sweat trickled down her cheeks. When Jean turned his gaze to the glass, he saw his younger self, which discouraged him, and he stared at his new self. He jumped up to the glass and started touching himself, not understanding what had happened to him. The young nurse looked at him and did not understand what was wrong with him. She decided that it was all because he hit his head hard. And while Jean was examining himself and touching his face with his hand, the girl smiled and decided that she needed to go and see a doctor. The man at this time darkened. He remembered himself dying and the gift that the dungeon presented. The realization clouded him, which meant that it was not a hallucination. It was not expected. It was real. He propped his chin up with his hand and chuckled. So that was what the dungeon's reward turned out to be. Surprisingly, it was the first time he'd heard of anything like it. I froze, looking at my reflection. It was a bit surprising. This had never happened before. They always brought me some other gifts. When the girl returned from the doctor, she opened her mouth in amazement and pulled back the curtain. The hospital bed was free. The man was not in the room. Sweat started running down her face again. The girl did not understand where he had gone. Jean was on the street, looked around and whistled at the large building. Came to a place where he had not been for 10 years. He folded his arms across his chest. It was a long time ago when he was last here, when he came to the association. Entering, he scratched his head with his hand. It was not at all the same as before, as he remembered. People were flickering in front of him. Lost and not knowing what to do, he asked the man who looked back at him over his shoulder. But in the end, he still helped, gave advice, pointed with his finger that if he wanted to go in, he needed to get a ticket at the kiosk, where the people were standing. Approaching the kiosk, he was confused and did not know what to do. He scratched his head with his hand again. The crowd behind him began to indignantly reprimand him. The man, who was in a hurry, asked to move out of his way, explaining that he had a lot to do. Genre turned to him and looked at the fist he was clenching in his hand. The man exhaled with displeasure. His whole posture was tense. The young man didn't lose his composure, turned around and pointed his finger at him and began to scold him that he needed to go back to the line and wait. But the man got angry. He grabbed him by the chest with his hand and brought his angry face closer to him. Suddenly they were interrupted by a huge man who appeared and thundered loudly for them to stop. The one who was indignant turned to him. Beads of sweat rolled down his face, and in front of him stood Paul, who held a high rank. Paul was a red-haired man with sharp eyes and equally sharp features. He was 2 heads taller than the men present. Admiring whispers were heard from the people. They turned to the hands that were hard as a rock. The one who was indignant and whispered an apology was embarrassed. He grinned and closed his eyes with pleasure. Paul really liked it when people said about him that he was a man of men. Jean whispered thoughtfully, looked at the man, who looked familiar to him, and squinted his eyes in anticipation of what would happen next. Again his gaze is directed at the guy. He exhaled with displeasure. There are a lot of thoughts in his head. Suddenly Jean screamed, pointed his finger, made the big guy sweat, open his mouth and widen his eyes from the nickname that came from the boy's lips. People around began to whisper, repeating this nickname, and Paul became confused and his face darkened. The young man came closer, spread his arms. A smile appeared on his face, and began to say that when they last saw him, he looked much fresher. Paul's gaze changed, his eyes darkened, his teeth gnashed. He began to shake all over, unhappy that his old name had been remembered. The high-ranking hunter, who was embarrassed by his cute name, changed it to a more manly name 10 years ago. It was a secret. Bowed his head, and did not understand where the person standing in front of him got this information from. The boy continued to smile, spreading his arms, wanted to ask him about something and did not notice his anger at all. He grabbed the boy by the collar again, shouted at him to stop, became confused, and looked at him with wide eyes. He brought his face, red with anger, closer to him and hissed like a snake, asking who he was and how dare he call him that. The boy didn't fall for it, wasn't afraid of his anger, smiled and gently noted that he had become ruder. Still in his arms, Jean continued to smile, not at all offended by the man's tone. He suddenly unclenched his fingers and let go of the collar of his shirt. He got carried away, he confessed, stepping back. Paul headed for the exit, commanding the boy to follow him, and that they should go to another place. But then he turned around and looked at him angrily. His red face continued to glow. There was no point in running away. He would find him. The main character rolled his eyes and exhaled. This guy amuses him, but still hurried after him. They went out into a large gymnasium, where they stood opposite each other like two rivals. The character thought, looked up, did not understand when such objects began to appear in the association, and what kind of place it was that brought him to. His eyes darkened, he looked straight at her and seriously stated that this was a place where they could fight each other. But the most important thing was that he was interested in how he knew his real name. He noted with displeasure, exhaling that he, Jean, is a great hunter, and some circumstances arose for him, which is why he now looks like this. He turned his displeased face again to the man, saying that he wanted to resolve everything peacefully. The red face from anger and tension turned again to the guy, clenched teeth so that you could hear the creak. He could not control himself. He raised his hand and flew at the main character. Now a few blows, and he will say everything at once. The young boy dodged, surprising Paul, and calmly began to explain that when a person grows up, he becomes calmer. Paul announced that the game was over, and began to transform into a huge werewolf beast. Towering, he stood over the character, now promising that he would treat him seriously, clenching his hands into fists. Now in the form of a beast, his eyes flashing yellow, he ran towards the young man, attacking with his paws. Jean flew back from the strong blow. The pebbles of the floor scattered to the sides. The blow was strong, but the character stood firm and did not fall, covering himself with his hand from dust and debris. Surprising with such resilience. The monster warned that it would be very painful. His face looked much friendlier than the stone face. The gym was filled with dust from another blow from Paul in the form of an animal, hunched over and looking at where the boy had flown off to. He looked at me with confusion. He had put too much effort into his blow. He didn't see that boy, but he showed himself to be a hero and pounced, clenching his hands into fists, fighting back and flying at the werewolf. It was so stupid, he froze, clenching his powerful jaw, although he was a supreme hunter. But the blow did not cause harm to this man. Jean's face turned black. He returned his own words. A mad smile appeared on his lips. The blow was delivered and even the light began to emanate from the force. The hero swung with one hand and stopped. Our character's blow was much stronger. A dent formed on the floor of the hall, and the beast flew away into the distance. It was all over. Jean stood there defeated, and Paul was lying on his back. There was only one blow and it was very strong, and it was able to knock down such a big guy. He darkened, raised his hand to his head, hoping that the man had not died, that he had overdone it. The boy looked up from under his brow, long blonde hair framing his disgruntled face. It was Paul Dublin, 25 years old. Jean, who was then of age, drawled out his name. His whitish eyes narrowed and stopped on the boy. The old man sat on the mountain of monsters he had slain, groaning and complaining about the pain in his back. Paul raised his head, beads of sweat running down his face, and breathed out the elder's name. The old man approached the boy, bowing down, and understood that power in its pure form was right there in front of him. Jana's face lit up with a smile. He noted that he needed to train more, and then everything would work out. He extended his hand, pointing at the young man. Now the man leaned over and tried to call Paul. It seemed to him that he was sleeping. He was a little worried about his condition. When he realized that there was a living person in front of him, he smiled and was afraid that he had used too much force. The boy grinned, sat down next to him, exhaled. I didn't teach him to greet people like that. I hadn't seen him for 10 years. The next question from the lying guy made him confused. He thought that he hadn't had enough. His hair even stood on end. As he got up, Jean rubbed his shoulder. A blessing had happened, as he called it, looking at the guy lying below. Paul closed his eyes, lowered his head. Unlike the skill, the ability is constantly activated. He made a verdict. Jean exhaled with displeasure. He realized that the boy in front of him also knew little about this blessing. The man appeared in all his beauty, his bare torso sparkling and shimmering with rough muscles, scratching the back of his head, regretting that he could not help his old friend. Jean's face changed. He saw that he was without clothes. He in turn apologized. The clothes were ruined because of his ability to turn into a beast. He smiled knowingly. He had become younger, for whatever reason, and he couldn't ask for more. Paul opened his arms and shouted that if he had become younger, then he could return to the hunters again, and people would know that the great hunter had returned. The next answer from Jean surprised him, and he couldn't find any words to respond to it. He didn't want people to know that he had returned. Paul's expression was surprised. He stared, waiting for the man's answer, trying to understand the reason for retirement. As soon as the hunter began to list the names of all those who were dear and important to them, Paul's face turned dark. He lowered his head, regretfully repenting that he could not forget them, because they were such dear people. It was a pity, he continued, that they all sacrificed themselves to protect him, and thanks to their lives, he was able to survive in many dungeons. The man screamed, putting his hand to his chest and hitting it hard. He would have done the same to save him, because he is very important to them. He cut it off and said that this was exactly why he retired, and raised his head. Paul looked at him in dismay, beads of sweat rolling down his face. As if plunging into memories, the young man continued that his presence at some point became too important for people. He was tormented by the thought that he had survived only thanks to those people whose deaths were on his hands. Memories took him back to those moments when those same people died, not sparing their lives, just for him. And he was afraid of a repetition. Paul began to understand and promised that if the man really wanted this, he would keep his secret. Unable to resist asking a question, he spread his arms out to the side and asked what he was planning to do now, but Jean was still thinking. He asked the young guy a question again. He stared in surprise and raised his head as soon as he heard about the request. With a slight smile on his lips, Jean looked at his wrist, on which a green bracelet was flaunting, with the help of which ranks were easily recognized. His gaze became serious as the memory brought him back to the moment when they were in the gym together with Paul. Pointing his hand upward, he wanted the boy to join them and explore the easy category dungeon. Paul stared at him. There was an investigation going on. He started telling, and he had a premonition, so now he was turning to him with a request. He scratched the back of his head with his hand. He just wants the elders to ensure him in any case. Jean exhaled in agreement. He will help as much as he can. He was rudely interrupted from his memories by a man with the same green bracelet on his hand, who pushed him in the back, clenched his teeth, and ordered him to move out of the way. The guy raised his head, asked someone to apologize, and as they passed by, the two guys looked at each other and snapped. Then the sycophants of that same man began to say that soon the brother would be promoted to the next rank, and a newcomer like him should not block the path of a promising warrior. The former leader of the Scorpion Gang, and now a hunter, grinned, realized that this was his first raid and asked to leave him, laughing condescendingly. The guys laughed, walked away with their hands in their pockets, laughed at the fact that he was extremely lucky. The guy stood there clutching his hands, and did not understand what had happened to them. He shouted that they were rude, thought that some people don't change and continue to judge others by their appearance, and hissed. Suddenly, he was pulled out of his thoughts again. A hand was on the guy's shoulder. The older man narrowed his eyes, assured that they always mock the newbie and should not be taken to heart. He moved away at a distance, introduced himself, his name was Cleo Stern, and addressed the boy as a student. But then Jean extended his hand and introduced himself. The man laughed, and he remembered the great hunter. When the conversation turned to age, the guy exhaled that he was 80 years old, but remained serious, not a hint of a joke. The man froze in confusion with a question, not understanding how he could be 80 years old, scratched his head in confusion and admitted that he would only be 18 this year. He laughed again, a good joke, put his arm around Cleo's shoulders, and said that he was the same age as his son, and that going down into the dungeon was apparently very profitable. Jean gritted his teeth and grinned, because no one knew. But he had a son. He would be about the same age as the man standing next to him. Suddenly girls appeared. They stood with bows in their hands and smiled, pleasantly surprised that among these boors there were even cute guys. The red-haired girl introduced herself and pointed to her friend, who was waving over her shoulder. She leaned over, approached the guy, repeated his name as if not believing it, and looked at him very carefully and intently. She got so close that she jumped up and gave me a kiss on the cheek and wished me luck in today's raid. The guy screamed, grabbed his cheek and didn't understand what she was doing, but the girl just grinned, pointing her finger at the fact that it was a greeting. The boy glanced sideways at the grinning man, clenched his teeth and pressed his lips together in displeasure. Cleo was happy for him. His hand fell on his shoulder again. A smile appeared and he became embarrassed. He understood that this was youth. He mumbled and looked away when he heard that he was called again, and his name sounded so surprised. In front of him stood a man in a strict black suit, his hair tucked back, his eyes narrowed, and he had a sword behind his back. The young man looked at him in surprise and asked who he was and what was required of him. He just smiled, narrowing his eyes. He is the leader of this raid, and welcomed the new participant in this event. Jean was confused again, scratched his head, flatteringly remarked that it was very nice, and they exchanged friendly smiles. Unable to contain my curiosity, I asked what kind of relationship they had with Paul, because it was unusual that he was the one who recommended him. He began to find out the story that he was a friend of his sister's relative. Toy's loud voice announced that everyone needed to gather. There would now be a briefing before entering the gate. In front of this man, everyone who took part in this raid lined up. The man put his hands on his hips and introduced himself, announcing that he was the leader of this event. He looked around at everyone present and said that they had every opportunity in the future to move to a higher level. People stood with impenetrable faces, listening attentively, and it was clear from their expressions that this gathering was not very pleasant. Only one person folded his arms across his chest and lowered his head contentedly, a smile appearing on his lips as soon as the flattering words were heard. With his hands on his hips, Toy continued to rant about the safe dungeon, but one should be prepared for anything. Closing his eyes, he showed the assembled people his index finger and called on everyone to obey him. Jean glanced sideways at the man next to him, who hissed in displeasure, not understanding the fuss around the dungeon. He turned around and corrected him that it was better to be careful than to leave everything. To prepare, he cried out indignantly, offended by this. He had already leaned forward with his fist at the ready, but a shout stopped the guy and he looked back at him. The same big guy who would soon take a higher rank grinned and stopped his sidekick. Coming closer to them, he began to speak about the veterans, sarcasm and humor shining through in every phrase. Toy attracted the attention of the guys to himself, announcing that the briefing was over and that the dungeon was now waiting for them. The man turned to them, smiling, touched the blue surface of the gate with his hand, and invited them to come in. The whole team emerged from the portal. Theo was the last one out. They looked around and stopped slowly. The girls grumbled. They found themselves in the desert. They said indignantly that they could have taken sunscreen, but the big guy wanted to finish his business here quickly and drink some cool beer. Jean began to pull off his jacket, exhaled, and was also pleasantly surprised that it turned out to be a desert. The leader spoke up and announced that if everyone had left, it was time to move towards their goal. The young man noticed that the other people were taking this mission too lightly. They were discussing the next thing. After that, they wanted to eat. Tying my jacket around my waist, I realized that there was no tension here. Looking around at all the people, memories reminded him of the moment when Paul exhaled and beads of sweat rolled down his face. He thought it would be easy because the entrance gate was small, but it turned out to be quite difficult. To this, Elder Jean then remarked to him that one should never lose one's vigilance when entering a dungeon. He sat on a huge bear, which stuck out its blue tongue, and the broken horns of this bear were lying nearby, and reminded that it was necessary to always remember his words. Now his face darkened and he frowned. The memories were so fresh that he suspected something was wrong. Previously, they judged the dungeon by the size of the gate, so everyone was on edge. Moving into it now, looking at the calm atmosphere in the team, he was surprised. He doubted that this was possible, that there would be no tension, so he turned to the leader with a question. Extending his hand, he asked what level this dungeon was. Theo asked a counter-question, explaining that this dungeon was literally something that only hunters of a certain rank could handle. He spread his hands and a smile appeared on his face. He said that in case of unforeseen circumstances, the hunter does not seem to act as a leader, so there is no need to worry. Jean put his hands on his chest and chuckled, saying that it was a pretty effective scheme. So he was tormented by doubts. He was haunted by the thought that the dungeon might be higher than expected. The leader became dejected and began to stutter and make excuses. But he was interrupted by the brute, who put his hands on his hips and impatiently called the guy over to him. He frowned and assumed that if it was so scary he could leave right now through the gate, no one would reproach him. A smile appeared on his lips. The sing-alongs also intervened, laughed, and asked not to scare the poor newcomer with such a thing. He continued the story again, making a calm face. He had already said several times, there was no need to worry, nothing would happen to them here. The complexity had already been determined with the help of a measuring device. After thinking for a moment, the young man decided that the people were speaking very confidently, while Theo noticed that the device for measuring the difficulty of the dungeon had been used for more than 5 years, and there has never been a single recorded case of incorrect assessment, so there is no need to worry. He smiled again and narrowed his eyes. Jean chuckled, not particularly trusting the information he received from the leader, and put his hand on his chest. The same man exhaled contentedly. He said that newcomers are a pain in the ass. He cursed. The guys looked at him. The guy couldn't help but say that for a man with such a build he whines too much. The big guy tensed up and looked at him with displeasure. He grabbed him by the shirt and shook him off a little. His teeth creaked, and he asked again angrily. The guy calmly remarked that he would advise him not to make noise in the dungeon. The man laughed too loudly, and mockingly asked that nothing would happen, and did not notice at all that danger was approaching them. Continuing to hold the boy by the chest, he frowned and asked about fear. A huge purple snake had been sneaking up on a group of people all this time, opened its mouth and stuck out its tongue. Its mouth was framed by sharp horns. The men were confused and lost. They screamed and stared at her, while she brought her face closer in a green glow. The man threw his head back and opened his mouth in surprise. He fell into a stupor and could not even make a sound. The muzzle flew at the guy, hissing. He flew towards his target for an attack a little, and then the most terrible thing would happen. A sharp swing, and Jean darted towards the snake like a shadow, cut it with lightning speed in one blow and crouched down, having done the job. The snake's head fell to the ground with a sound. Silence reigned around. Everyone looked at the monster. The arrogant man gritted his teeth, didn't understand what had happened, and didn't even manage to see it. Jean scolded the guy, discouraging him with words of reminder about safety and noise. He looked at it with condemnation, and concluded that in such places, first of all, a noisy person, like the bull standing in front of him, is very attractive. Out of impotent rage, he clenched his fists and watched the guy leave. The appearance of a red-haired girl with a question to the leader about this creature that is in this dungeon should not. I looked at the face that was lying on the ground. This creature definitely didn't look like it would easily complete a mission. She sat down and extended her hand to the muzzle. Toy watched closely, mentally reasoning that there should be monsters here slightly larger than a dog. The monster must definitely be in a higher-ranking dungeon. Its entire appearance was frightening. The dark-haired girl lowered her head and exhaled with hidden fear, not knowing what they would do next. Spreading her arms out to the sides, she suggested asking adults for help, but the boy leaning his back on the stone did not allow it. The boy looked down, as if he was remembering something, and began to scold the standing girl about adults. The argument was gaining momentum, but a hissing sound from the side distracted them from this activity, forcing them to look in horror at the entrance to the cave. In the gap of light, a snake's head flashed, opening its mouth and sticking out its forked tongue. The young people stared at her in fear, their eyes wide open and horror splashing in them. The crowd of people followed the leader through the large rocks, looking around, and all were immersed in their own thoughts. Theo walked ahead, narrowing his eyes and clenching his fists hard. John followed him and rubbed the back of his head. The leader of the group was thinking. A drop of sweat was running down his cheek. His eyes were narrowed and his frowning forehead formed a wrinkle. He was so deeply immersed in his thoughts. The wrinkle appeared even more strongly, deepened. He squeezed his eyes tightly. He had anxious doubts about this dungeon, which he could not cope with. The monster was of the highest rank. He turned his head, waved, looked at the guy. Jean immediately suspected that something was wrong. The young man couldn't stand it and finally screamed. He understood that something was wrong, but the thoughts in the leader's head were spinning. He wondered if this boy could defeat a monster of a different rank so easily. He turned away from him again, his eyes clenched, his teeth clenched, his lips forming a narrow line, the thought process visible on his face. Therefore, he did not pay attention to those around him. He was immersed in his thoughts. His neck was tense, his vein was pulsating. He tried to understand the situation, but he remembered that there had never been a case before where the assessment of complexity was mistakenly blamed everything on his imagination. The same young man who was unhappy that the hike was taking too long, all wet from the heat, clenched his teeth and exhaled, staring ahead with displeasure. He couldn't stand it, raised his hand and clenched it into a fist, turning to the leader and saying that they had been walking for about 30 minutes, and how quickly they would reach their destination. He turned to them. Since everyone was tired, he suggested taking a short break. The girl was rubbing her lower back. It was too hot and her legs hurt. Everyone was tired. Jean put his hands on his chest, exhaled, clicked his tongue and looked at Theo with displeasure. Thoughts were running through his head that the youth had no courage at all and could not go any further even after 30 minutes. The brute chuckled. It seemed he heard the guy's reasoning, but noticed that it had suddenly become cloudy. He turned around and saw that behind him on the rock, there was a snake sitting with an open mouth and sharp teeth. A huge snake towered over them, also the same color as the previous monster, purple, a huge tail circling above them. The leader shouted. This monster looked bigger and stronger than before. Apparently he decided that it was the boss, so he shouted that everyone needed to prepare for battle. The snake twisted, curled, and began to move towards them. Its hissing was heard in the air. The man glanced at the boy, looked at him and thought that if this boy had dealt with the first snake, then he could deal with it now. So he turned back to the snake, grabbed the handle of his ball and tried to pull it out, grinning. Not allowing himself to be stopped by the leader, who was shouting in a pathetic attempt to call to reason, the man rushed into the attack. Theo could only stand there and scream about the danger, his brow furrowed again. He gritted his teeth, and they would knock him down. He made a show of making sure they watched closely, not feeling fear, but because he hoped that he could cope with such a monster. A weapon already appeared in his hand, and with a cry, he rushed at the snake, folded into a protective circle of the snake, and only the eyes were visible. He jumped and hit the ball, but it didn't cause any harm to the snake. It didn't even leave a wound. Jean looked at the man intently, because she knew that it was stupid to attack now when the monster was in a defensive position. And his attitude towards attacking the dungeon was completely wrong. The man shook and froze near the monster, who was as if in a cocoon. Finally he hissed. His forked tongue stuck out of his mouth. The snake's green eyes hypnotized the young man, who stood with his mouth open and beads of sweat running down his cheek. It flashed through his mind that this was the end. The snake with green drooping eyes opened its mouth and was already flying towards the confused man. But Theo managed to grab it and pull it away just in time. The snake's snout hit the ground and splashed stones in all directions. The leader asked him how he was feeling, gritted his teeth and narrowed his eyes. Theo closed his eyes and frowned. Something irreparable would happen now and a member of his team would die. The leader turned to the snake and shouted for it to stay away, and the man fell to his knees from fatigue. He narrowed his eyes. A bead of sweat from fear rolled down his face. As the only top-class hunter, he had to destroy this monster. He pulled out his sharp sword, and pushing off with his foot, he ran towards the snake, which had already stuck its head out of its cocoon. He swung the ball with a loud noise, wanting to attack the monster and cause harm. There was a cracking sound as the sword slashed across the snake's defenses, but it didn't cause any injury. His attack failed to cause any harm. He gritted his teeth, but then he heard advice that he needed to aim for the head. Theo clutched his sword, heard the boy's words, looking where the head was, and the snake was already flying towards the man, still looking for his head with its eyes. It had made up its mind. Jumping up, he swung his sword and seemed to freeze right in front of the monster. He hung in the air, swung his ball over his head, and rushed to attack the snake. He shouted loudly that he should die already, closed his eyes, and his mouth was distorted in anger. The guy fell down and the monster's head flew off the body, and for a long time the headless neck searched for its end in the air. The man landed neatly on the ground, without looking back at the fallen head behind him, and exhaled noisily. People were happy that they were with him. They shouted that everything worked out. They breathed out with relief all the tension that remained with them. Only Jean approached Theo and asked how he was, and he sighed tiredly. He admitted that it was dangerous. The guy thanked him for saving him, smiled. They defeated the boss easier than he thought. The girl approached him and clarified that the dungeon was now cleared. Theo exhaled, but there were still doubts. She asked again why nothing had changed, and the men looked at her, puzzled. It seemed strange that when a dungeon was cleared, a notification would appear. He squinted his eyes, and the wrinkle would appear on his forehead again. He didn't believe it. But the snakes continued to pursue them, and now 2 snakes appeared on the rocks, and their hissing tormented the people. Theo was upset that the monster he, a top-class hunter, had barely defeated was not a boss. Chuckled and gripped his weapon tighter. Jean put his hand on his hip and said, which was a shock to everyone, that this was not an easy dungeon. He shouted, opening his mouth and looking straight at the guy, again saying what everyone should hear and understand. He didn't believe it. The association couldn't possibly have made a mistake in assessing the difficulty. But he had no choice, and he stood up, defending his group of people. The elderly man cried out that these snakes were chasing them. It was clear to everyone present. You can't argue with that. Theo turned away, clenched his teeth and closed his eyes. He couldn't believe that this dungeon had a different rank. He turned to his group. They had no choice. It was time to retreat. The leader made the decision. Theo broke out in a sweat. They need to get out of here quickly and ask for support. They need to be careful. A lot depends on his decision. Jean looked at the leader. He could be praised. He quickly assessed and accepted the situation. A soft smile touched his lips. The young man looked at him without taking his eyes off him. And he liked Theo. He was quite a capable guy. And again they set out on their journey. Again they walked one after another through this desert. George couldn't stand it anymore, he cried out, turning to the leader. He blamed him for escaping from such a level. He believed that a hunter of the highest rank was not worthy of running away. He turned around and tried to explain, spreading his arms, that the monster in this dungeon was not just of average rank. They were of a higher level. The guy was confused and asked again. Speaking with pressure, the man was indignant. He did not understand how the association did not appreciate this dungeon. Otherwise, how could a newbie defeat a monster? He was still scratching his understanding that Jean had dealt with the first monster. Our hero corrected him so that he wouldn't make noise, otherwise he would attract monsters. This made the guy even more excited. He's not afraid of them, he was just not careful before. The guy sprayed himself even more, and didn't notice that the rustling sound came from a depression in the stone. George ran away from the cave but kept looking at it, clenching his hands into fists, gritting his teeth. The leader also looked in that direction. Instead of a monster, they heard a plaintive squeak, and the girl asked for help, peeking out from behind a rock. A girl with purple hair and tears in her eyes asked for help, holding onto his shoulder. Claire ran up to her and was about to touch the girl, whispering soothing words to her. The child fell into Claire's arms and whispered with the last of her strength that her friend needed help. She raised her head and began to tell him that they were attacked by a monster that appeared out of nowhere, and that her friend was seriously injured when he tried to save her. Theo closed his eyes. The thought process in his head was going very hard. He didn't understand how a child could end up in this cave. He leaned forward, asking the girl how they ended up here, because they didn't look like a hunter. The girl with purple hair looked away and admitted that one guy said that there was a part-time job in the dungeon where she could earn a lot of money from her. All she had to do was hide quietly. Then George stepped forward. He understood what was being discussed and what the girl was saying. Everyone looked at him. He shouted loudly, pointed his finger at the girl. "I heard that there was a legend about the robbers," Jean asked again, not understanding what that meant. Then Theo tried to explain that there were people who cleaned up raids to get a reward for completing the dungeon. Still, our hero didn't like such reckless children who risked their lives in the dungeon. George also didn't like that such strong monsters appeared in the dungeon. He thought that it was all because of the brats. They made the dungeon unstable. The leader assured that the appearance of strong monsters does not concern these children at all, but one could not be absolutely sure of this. He stood his ground. The elderly man interrupted the argument, turned to the leader and asked what to do with the children. Now the goal is to save them. Showing too much emotion, George was outraged that they had to be saved in such a situation, and did not want to go and save them. The leader closed his eyes. He understood that this situation would be very difficult, but they had no choice. Jean intervened in the conversation and volunteered to save the children. Theo couldn't let this happen. It was too dangerous. He turned his head in different directions. Pointing his finger back at himself, he added that he couldn't just leave like that and asked if he could go alone. George grinned. He won't stop someone who decided to risk his life. He gave in to Theo. The character said that he would go to save the children, and he should take care of the rest of the group. He realized that in front of him was not quite a simple hunter, who initially seemed not quite a mature hunter. The leader of the group made the right decision. He agreed with the guy and relied on him. Coming closer to the girls, the young man announced that he would carry the child, which surprised Claire. The girl with purple eyes leaned forward, also looking at the guy in surprise. She barely audibly asked about her friend and whether he would definitely save him. The answer was important to her. Jean smiled at her with a dazzling smile, such that even his face lit up, and answered confidently that it was true. The leader gave the order for them to continue moving. George scratched his head thoughtfully. Approaching their backing singers, the men whispered to each other, certain that the boy was definitely heading towards certain death. Claire had already approached her friend, but was looking thoughtfully at Jean, who was already lifting the little girl into his arms. She noticed, without taking her eyes off him, that everything should be fine with him. She did not understand the reason, but she was worried about him. The group leader left with a heavy heart. He had no choice, he hoped. He hugged himself with his arms, exhaled. He was very scared, you cursed, clenching your fists in impotent anger, boy. He remembered well that adult with a gold tooth, who smiled widely and promised that it would be a complete freebie, who persuaded him to go. And while he was telling and flattering that this dungeon was not too difficult, the boy, although he doubted, was already ready for anything. And hugging her by the shoulders, the man continued to assure that nothing terrible would happen. Even if they caught her, she would simply receive a warning, so there was no need to worry. The inserted gold tooth sparkled, the eyes remained cold, but he continued to tempt the boy with the idea of imminent wealth. Now, hugging himself, he cursed and swore at that man and worried about his little sister. A rustling sound from the entrance made the boy tense up. He tightly clutched the stick lying nearby and prepared for what would happen next. The appearance of my sister caused surprise. I didn't quite understand. I examined her. The girl was running ahead, and behind her, holding onto her waist, walked Jean, who saw the boy and realized that he was the girl's brother. Pointing at the man, the girl noticed that he was a hunter who had come to help them. Hans doubted him because the hunter in front of him was too young, pointed his finger and asked again, uncertainly. Our hero walked forward and flicked the guy, demanding that he think about his words. The boy started screaming, tears gushed from his eyes. He grabbed his hair, did not understand who was standing in front of him, and Jean was outraged that the boy was talking rudely to him. He concluded that if he was a student, he should be at home doing his homework. The girl intervened, looking down, and began to talk about how they had nowhere to go. They had run away from home, they had no money, so they had no choice. Our hero stopped, upset that these children had been deceived and had been led into a dangerous place, and saw how the sister leaned towards her brother. It's time for them to go to the others, Jean noted cheerfully, assessing the situation. Before they had time to leave, a huge snake with spikes on its neck and horns hissed, wriggling nearby. The guy stood up. He thought they had escaped. He swore. But it turned out that this was not the case. He returned to his place. He twisted his leg. He should be left. The girl started screaming. She couldn't leave him again. The character said with a smile that they would not leave him, and the surprised children stared at the hunter's back. The boy couldn't stand it and shouted for him to grab his sister and run away. There's no point in fighting here. He was too relaxed. So without turning around, he said that he shouldn't be so arrogant, forcing the boy to open his mouth. Children should be under the protection of adults, he said decisively, and rushed into the attack. She moved between the rocks. Theo walked ahead. The others followed him through the desert. George walked with displeasure, clenched his hands, cursed. He didn't like that they were in the dungeon and running away instead of fighting. Theo turned around and said that they should be patient for a little while. They were almost there. He thoughtfully lowered his head, his thoughts hovering in worry about the children, and the fact that Hunter Jean must be fighting alone. He lowered his head even lower and closed his eyes. He was overcome by doubts about how he was doing, whether he had made the right decision. An elderly man, leaning on a rock, noticed ahead that there was a gate somewhere here. His mouth dropped open at what he saw. He was surprised and shook his head, as if he couldn't believe what he saw. He turned to his leader, calling him over to him. He also raised his head in surprise. The man shouted very loudly that the gate was disappearing and that he needed to hurry. The clouds were gathering. Theo screamed with his mouth open. He was stunned by such a phenomenon. George, who also came closer, opened his mouth in amazement. Then he turned to the leader and clenched his fists and shouted that they had been following him all day. So what should they do now? Theo's face darkened. The gate to this dungeon appeared about 3 days ago. If it closes, the harbinger of this is that the dungeon will begin to grow. People were huddled together, trying to figure out what to do next. The man was lost in his thoughts. Suddenly he remembered those children and assumed that the dungeon began to grow because the children entered earlier. The leader understood that all the people were worried about him. A man came up and shyly scratched his head, but decided to clarify what they would do next. Theo threw up his hands and noted that the gates would open again once they had cleared out the dungeon. George cried out indignantly, "They won't be able to cope with monsters of this level because they are weak hunters." Then the man turned to him and said if they don't clean it up, then the gate won't open and they'll be stuck here forever. If a rampage starts, the gates will be forced open. It will be a little dangerous, but they can use this chance to escape. People gathered in a group again, exhaled. They had no other option. They needed to calm down and assess the situation. He chuckled with displeasure and looked at the leader, frowning so that a wrinkle formed. They were surrounded by monsters. They hissed and moved towards them, making a terrible sound. The people recoiled in horror. They were surrounded by monsters, and were confused for just a moment. The monsters were heading towards them, flashing green. Theo grabbed his weapon and ordered everyone to prepare for battle. The leader calmly reasoned that there were only 5 of them, and if they calmly took advantage of their weaknesses, even low-ranking hunters would be able to destroy them. You have to follow his orders. He pulled out his sword at the ready. Now he will lead them. George ducked, cursed in his hand, his weapon raised, ready to attack. Theo clenched his fists and rushed forward, shouting in a commanding tone that they needed to follow him. The wind swung the ball and jumped on the first monster, who had already exposed his mouth. The sword flashed and tried to cut the snake in half. He clenched his teeth. Another monster hissed nearby. The snake threw the man away. He was able to group himself and cover himself. The blows delivered were useless. They did not cause any harm to the monster. Heard a girl's scream from the side. "We'll help cope. We'll provide assistance." The fire spread. The man jumped, and they all attacked the monster together. The one who helped was a girl with purple hair and glasses. She grabbed the staff. Theo saw that the monster had turned its attention to the woman, and cried out that his opponent was him, and not someone else. He swung his sword and cut off the head from the body. Blood spurted out. The body still hung in the air. The leader landed on the ground. His head fell off. But the 2 that were on his body hissed again. The people stopped. They were surrounded by monsters. There were still 3 snakes left. It was difficult, but they should cope. George said out loud that these creatures are not so scary and can be dealt with easily. A monster with 3 heads rose up behind the young people, hissed and flashed its green eyes, ready to attack. The man recoiled. He saw that the monsters were approaching them. He exhaled, wondering how this was possible. Theo closed his eyes. His face darkened. The reason for the appearance of these creatures remained a mystery. Apparently the dungeon went mad, the snake wagged its tail, and people scattered to the sides. George's friend fell to his knees and found himself dangerously close to the monster, screaming and asking his brother to save him. The guy ran away as fast as he could, looking at the man asking for help. But he didn't linger. His own life was more important. The boy was all sweaty. He looked at his friend in shock, and his voice was already becoming quieter. He hiccuped in fear when he noticed that a face with sharp teeth was next to him. A stone hit the snake's face from the side, thereby distracting it from the man. But now the monster's object was another person. It was Claire, her legs shaking and unresponsive. The creature turned its fanged face. Clutching a bow in her hands, the girl came to the rescue, but she herself was afraid of the monster. She shouted, giving the order to the leader, who flew into the air and struck, cutting the head off the body. The sharp blade flashed and hit the target straight on, squeezing the handle of the weapon with both hands. He cut one head, returned to his place, went down, thought that it was easier now. Good. But it turned out that the guy had miscalculated. The head was not the monster's weak point, and quickly recovered. He narrowed his eyes and looked intently, hoping to cope and not let his group down. The snake growled, leaned forward, and the wave knocked Theo off his feet. He flew away from him. The stones flew to the sides. Drops of blood flowed out along with the leader's cough. He closed his eyes and beads of sweat rolled down his cheek. Claire screamed as she saw the leader thrown back onto the rocks and hit his back, fear flashing in the girl's eyes. She recoiled from him, backed away, still clutching her weapon in her hands. She looked in surprise at the man who appeared next to her, but didn't have time to say a word. Only by following orders did she end up in the arms of a boy, who carried her away from the monster that was already digging the ground. The heads of the huge snake hissed and twisted behind the young people. Steam was coming out. Stones were flying to the sides. The monster was angry. As soon as she saw who saved the girl, her cheeks turned pink and she exhaled in surprise. Jean looked at the creature. A smile lit up his face. He praised Claire. Now it was his turn to intervene. The young people stopped, looked at each other, and the girl, embarrassed, wrung her hands. I asked again about the girl's health, and he said that everything was fine, with the same smile. The leader took them out of their mutual stares and asked the hunter questions about the children. He closed his eyes, asked in confusion about the children, and still sat leaning against the stone wall. The main character smiled and assured the man that the children were fine, and there was no need to worry about them. He was worried about something completely different. He looked back at the three-headed monster. The gates were closed. The boss was here. He concluded about the riot of the dungeon. He squeezed and closed his eyes. Drops of hail rolled down his face. Asked for forgiveness. Considered it entirely his fault. Jean calmed him down. Their leader had already stood up, holding his weakened hand with one hand. He understood that the situation was too difficult even for a leader of such high rank. I turned around and looked at him with a smile and praised him, because he really did try hard. And now the main character turned to the monster, assessed it, and squeezed the weapon in his hands. He looked from under his forehead. His eyes sparkled. Now it was his turn to help. He smiled a strange, slightly crazy smile. Spreading his arms out to the sides, the young man flew into an attack on the three-headed monster with complete determination in his eyes. The boy flew up and stopped right in front of the monster, preparing to attack and cut off its head. He flew up to one of the three heads unnoticed, swung his sword, and was almost touching the snake's neck. He delivered a crushing blow with his sword in a jump, and the monster flew into pieces, its head separated from its body. He jumped back from the still-moving headless neck, without turning around, thinking that he had chopped up another one. The leader stood up and shouted that it was useless. This monster's head regenerated even when attacked. Jean glanced at him. He turned away, looked at the monster, who was now actively recovering. Irritation overcame him, bowed his head to Theo in apology. Claire folded her hands and prayed, closed her eyes. It was all useless. Death awaited them. The hero whistled in surprise. Theo's face darkened. He also thought that this was the end for them, and they would not be able to get out of here. Jean answered everyone with a smile. There is no need to give up. People looked at him in amazement. With his words, he shook all feelings from hatred to hope. He looked back at the girl, joked with a sparkling smile. He was having fun. Claire's face darkened and she expressed displeasure that the current situation was not conducive to jokes. But the leader of the group, moving towards them, holding his shoulder, praised the boy and took his side. They gave up too early. They need to fight to the end, as the motto of a top-ranking hunter said. He also offered his help, but stopped the man's impulse. He saw his wound. He should take care. He clenched his fist and raised it, thanking the older man and his healing abilities. The girls looked closely at the men, resolutely pursing their lips as if gathering their strength. Clenching their hands into fists, clutching their weapons, the girls also decided to provide assistance. He looked at the volunteers with a smile. Jean liked this fighting spirit, and not what had happened before. He appeared before the monster and asked the group for only one thing: don't give up. Determined that if they kept attacking, they would eventually find the monster's weak point. He asked for one more thing to cover him, and the main character rushed to attack the monster, cheerfully encouraging the group of people. Only the head remained intact, but the monster was stronger than ever, with fire bursting out of its huge, toothy mouth. The creature attacked the boy. Somewhere the leader was screaming, and Jean saw only fire around him, which only grew larger. Breaking through another column of fire, the boy was already visible as a black dot, but he continued the attack, not giving up. Flashing blue, Jean defeated the three-headed serpent, seemingly very easy and simple to cut off the head. The old man asked the leader about this boy. His skills raised doubts. He was not a simple low-ranking hunter. Theo couldn't find the words to respond. Jean looked back and exhaled. He couldn't neutralize the monster. Regeneration started working. He squinted, calculated the situation, looked at everything and everyone, immersed in his thoughts about victory. I looked at the parts of the monster that were seething and bubbling, recovering. I stopped for just a moment. He turned around and threw over his shoulder that he was already tired of this three-headed monster, which continued to regenerate even after its heads were blown off. Suddenly the hero's attention was drawn to something on the rock. He chuckled and noticed a black liquid flowing down the stones. He grinned. He decided for himself, and it was worth it for him to try, to go there. Jump after jump, and I found myself in the very place where something interesting seemed to me. From what he saw, his eyes widened and his mouth opened. A nervous laugh escaped. He found what he was looking for. He landed carefully on the ground, and behind him a monster fell, the very main one that was hiding between the stones and the rock. The group of people stared at the guy in amazement. Their surprise knew no bounds, but they continued to hold the weapon in their trembling hands. Suddenly, blue transparent signs appeared in front of their faces, announcing the end of the mission. Claire's mouth fell open as she read the ad, unable to speak, just exhaling. The group of people were happy. They were able to do it. They managed to get through and clear the dungeon. The leader smiled. His face brightened. He closed his eyes. Sincere joy took over him completely, because until the end he himself was not sure of victory. The girls, not hiding their smiles, looked at each other, almost squealing in joy at the outcome. The gates appeared without delay. A funnel with a passage opened in front of them. Theo turned to Jean's voice and thanked him. If it weren't for him, all these people would have died here. Jean's appearance with his hand on his head caused smiles. This man was very helpful. They considered him amazing. The man was talking on the phone, swearing and not believing that a low-ranking hunter had dealt with the monster on his own. The guy stood with his hands behind his back, brought a report to the Sork Guild, and now gave the information to the head. He lowered his head to the glass cheek of the hood, but admitted that the recording was completely true. Theo assured the chief that Hunter Jean should be accepted into the guild. The strength he demonstrated in this raid was real. In general, the hunter would have continued, if not for him. But he was interrupted by a man whose face darkened. He shouted at him and forbade him to say anything further. Paul folded his hands and leaned forward, leaning on the table, wondering if the hunter could handle it alone. But Theo was not afraid. He raised his face and noticed that it was just like that. They had not noticed such an outstanding hunter. Unclasping his hands, he pointed his finger at the sheet, pretending this time that he had not seen this report, and asked her to leave. Bowing discontentedly as he said goodbye, Theo accepted what the leader said without daring to raise his eyes. Left alone, the man clenched his fists. His neck was tense. He was deep in thought. The guildmaster touched his face, squeezing his eyes from fatigue. He allowed the gentleman who was in the next room to leave. The character came out from behind the door. He asked about the hunter. The man assured him that he had settled everything, so there was nothing to worry about. This time the guy really caused a big stir. Surely someone from the association will pay attention to this incident. The hero cursed, called the man a fool. People could get hurt. Didn't he ask him to prepare for such situations? He admitted, raising his hand to his face, that all his expectations had been exceeded. Everything written in the report was true. Now, Jean has already said that there is a problem with the assessment of the dungeon. The association probably already knows about its mistake, but the fact that it is silent despite such a big problem is proof of this. Coming closer to the chair of the head continued to fold his arms on his chest, that this is not the only problem, stared at him with a question. He nodded his head and looked at the guy when he started saying that there was an association behind the dungeon robbers who deceive children. He confessed, clenching his fists and stroking them. A sinister grin appeared. He raided their base and found out about it. Paul leaned forward. His face changed. A wrinkle formed on his forehead. The organization does not want to admit its problem. Their authority is directly related to their power. With his hands on his hips, Jean noticed that perhaps the man sitting opposite him was right. The boy couldn't resist. He leaned forward and asked Paul if he was just going to sit back and watch their actions. He was very worried about the answer. Paul returned to his place, exhaled, closed his eyes. He was sorry, but now they don't have enough evidence. He continued to talk about the strength and power of the organization, that it had grown and become bigger than the boy thought, that in order to resist it he had to be more careful. The main character listened attentively. He raised his hand and reminded the guy of his own words that he shouldn't act hastily. Jean agreed with him. He thoughtfully touched his chin, rubbing it, closed his eyes, and had already laid out a plan of his actions, what they should do first, and would start by looking through the records of the latest trades in the dungeons. He raised his head when he heard Paul remark that it was impossible to do, and stared at him blankly. The man reminded the gentleman that he was now a low-ranking hunter, and folded his hands on the table. He continued to talk about how the records were only available to hunters of a higher rank. The man cried out. His eyes widened and beads of sweat ran down his cheeks. He had completely forgotten about this rule. He put his hands on his chest and noticed, darkening, that he was hiding his identity rather troublesomely, and was upset. But Paul smiled, holding up the sheet of paper in his hands. He said that now was just the time. He handed the paper to the guy, and he now stared at the sheet in his hands, not understanding what it was. A crowd of people, whose faces could not be seen, simply crowded in a black mass near the entrance to the Hunters Association. The young man raised his hand to his face, and, as if through a megaphone, shouted that the participants in the promotion exam should line up in a queue, and pointed in the direction with his hand. Claire, the girl from the dungeon, was also here. She was clutching her elbow with her hand and standing in anticipation. The girl closed her eyes. She was nervous because this was her first exam for promotion. She admitted that she honestly doubted her own strength, whether she had gained enough experience for this, and she opened her eyes sharply and thought about the guy who saved them from the dungeon. Memories immediately dived into the time when she, embarrassed, thanked him for saving her, and wondered whether he would also appear here today or not. She immediately jerked herself up, threw her hands up and began to hit her head with them, thereby attracting attention to herself. Just as suddenly calming down, Claire turned her attention to the guy standing in front, who was indignant about the fact that the crowd was so big. The young man's actions outraged the girl, she said indignantly, raising her hands to her chest. Everyone is lining up. He looked around in confusion. Turning completely to face her, the man showed her the bracelet and spoke, mocking her with his red bracelet. She stared at him with wide eyes at this red bracelet. It meant a high-ranking hunter. Noticing a green bracelet on her hand, which meant a lower rank, the girl even became embarrassed and covered it with her hand. But she immediately got over her embarrassment, leaned forward towards him, and told him that his rank did not give him a reason to behave like that. The man moved closer to her and whispered ingratiatingly that strength is power, showing her a red bracelet. He leaned even closer and whispered that the world they lived in was the very world in which power decided everything. Having looked Claire over from head to toe, he concluded that she was completely to his taste up close. The girl was confused by this. Even closer, the guy touched her shoulder with his hand and asked about the guy, which made her even more embarrassed. Jean's appearance was unexpected. He grabbed the man's hand and asked him to behave more restrainedly, because his behavior now looked shameful. Claire recognized him. She screamed, and a bead of sweat rolled down her cheek. The guy turned his head towards the main character and remarked with displeasure, gritting his teeth. Apparently she has a boyfriend. The character clarified because he did not understand what had just happened. The girl screamed that it was not so and clenched her hands. After looking at the guy closely, he noticed that he also had a green bracelet, which meant that he was of a lower rank and should not be feared. He started to snap back, showing his bracelet, insulting the boy and bragging about his rank badge. Without holding back his emotions, Jean shouted that he could clearly see his bracelet. The guy got angry, muttered, "How dare he grab his hand without fear," and clenched his teeth. The young people stood opposite each other. The guy was squeezing his hand and was all tense, but Jean was in a relaxed state. The boy was completely confused. He didn't understand. He tried to shake off his hand, but she held him tightly. Suddenly the hand attracted attention and asked the hunter pack to stop immediately. He turned his fierce face and shouted who else wanted to measure strength with him. It was the security. They looked closely at the guy, who was already covered in beads of sweat. They grabbed the struggling man by the arms, who was screaming to be let go, but knew that he had to follow orders. If he continued to cause trouble, he would be asked to leave. For some reason he paid special attention to these two, shouted menacingly, and promised that he would remember them. Jean exhaled, following him with his eyes, and said that he was a fool. Claire also looked, pressing her hand to his chest. But she turned to the guy, thanked him again for his help. Jean laughed, and clarified that she had also come for a promotion. The girl's face brightened and she nodded her head in agreement. It is not done that often, so she decided to do it. Claire expressed her concerns, and shared that the rank might still be too high for her. She glanced sideways and saw the boy's hand touch her in a supportive manner, calming her down and assuring her that everything would work out. As he got closer, he continued to say that she would succeed. She needed to believe in herself, and the main thing was not to overdo it. She became embarrassed, lowered her eyes, and nervously fidgeted with her hands. She didn't understand why her heart was beating so hard, and even blamed it on the fact that she had gone crazy. She looked at the bent-over guy and didn't understand. She always liked mature men, but this young man gave off the aura of an adult. Suddenly, the guy handed her something in his hand. She looked at him with interest and was even a little surprised. Jean became embarrassed, rubbed his nose, saved it, and since they met again, he gave it to her. And the girl ended up with a sweet jelly made from red beans in her hands. Waving his arms, he began to talk about how if you eat something sweet, you can relax a little. Jean turned over his shoulder and wished her luck on the exam, but the discouraged girl could not say anything. She stared at her hands, which contained jelly, carefully examined the candy wrapper, and didn't even know what to say after that. I exhaled sharply, thinking that someone might like this, and a bead of sweat rolled down my cheek. She brought the jelly to her mouth with both hands and began to eat, thinking that the guy was like an old man in a young man's body. Immersed in her feelings and her thoughts, she didn't notice how a girl was looking at her from the balcony, propping her cheek up with her hand. In a red dress and with purple hair, she exhaled sharply. If Jean had fought with the guy who pestered him, what a sight it would have been. At the same time, the man who tried to rebel in the hall cursed, clenching his jaw tightly and frowning. Greeting everyone was a small man in glasses, who was constantly sweating and wiping his forehead with a handkerchief. John Senior, the examiner who was responsible for the promotion tests. He pointed his finger up, explained why they were all gathered here today, and briefly told about the exam. The men scratched their heads and stared thoughtfully. The presenter said that the exam was conducted as follows. First, 2 first-rank hunters would spar against each other. The match will be over when one of the parties can no longer fight or admit defeat. But if a dangerous situation arises during the fight, the examiner will immediately intervene and stop the test, so there is no need to worry about your safety. The man has finished. Turning his hands to the side, the winner is determined in a duel with the examiner of the rank to which he wants to move. People began to make noise, dissatisfied. They realized that if he did not defeat the hunter from the rank that he was claiming. John assured that regardless of victory or defeat, if the examiner recognized your skills, then there would be a promotion. He turned his nose up, a smile lit up his face and wished all the hunters good luck. The man happily scratched his head and smiled. Finally, this day had come. The former leader of the Scorpion Gang, a mid-ranking hunter, arrived for the exam. John noticed that after going through the dungeon that day, his magical power had increased significantly. He was glad that he was grateful even to the newcomer there, that he cleared the dungeon, and the guy gained strength. Anticipating his promotion, he couldn't wait to find out who his opponent would be. He was happy until he saw Jean, who was smiling and waving his hand at him. He was an opponent in the exam. The hero came close to the man, patted him on the chest and wished him a good fight. Tears poured from the boy's eyes. He cursed and understood that he would not be able to defeat Jean, so he said goodbye to his high rank. In a large gym, Claire stood opposite a man holding a bow in her hands. The boy held a sword in his hand and touched his shoulder with one hand. His legs were shaking. Claire resolutely pulled the bowstring and inserted the arrow, her hair flying in different directions. Without taking her eyes off her target, she was about to strike. The arrow slid off with a whistle and flew towards its target, while the girl ran forward, her mouth open and her jacket fluttering behind her shoulders. The boy saw the arrow, opened his mouth and beads of sweat rolled down his face and he cried out in fear. He held the dagger out in front of him, and the arrow hit the sword and dagger straight, and the cap bounced off his head to the side. The girl stopped and watched as the guy was thrown back by a wave of blue. Having hit his opponent's wall, the boy sank down on the floor, his legs spread out, and exhaled the air from his lungs. Examiner John announced that Claire had won this round and congratulated her on the event. She turned her head towards the speaker. She didn't expect that it would be so easy to complete the task. She looked surprised. She didn't believe in her own strength. She stared in amazement at her hands, which held the bow. She was surprised. She herself had no idea that she possessed such strength. The girl was brought out of her thoughts by the sound of approaching footsteps. It was Jean, who folded his hands behind his head and smiled joyfully at her to inform her of her victory. She rushed too hastily to the young man, inquiring about his winnings, put his hands in his pockets, and admitted that more or less. The boy, the former head, was lying hunched over on the floor. The examiner sat up and asked him to leave the area. The girl was overcome with doubt. It all looked rather strange. Jean looked at her in surprise. She dropped her hand, looked at it, and admitted that she suddenly felt very strong. It felt like her magical power had increased dramatically compared to what it had been. He answered this easily, raising his hand, which had just recently cleared a dungeon above his usual level. He continued to explain that by defeating monsters in the dungeon, you not only get magic stones, but also absorb the magical power of the monsters. The girl exhaled and closed her eyes. She knew this. The higher the dungeon you defend, the more powerful magic and purer magic stones you can obtain. According to unofficial data, clearing a dungeon of a lower rank, not lower than her own, she will feel stronger than the boy usually finished with. Overjoyed, she grabbed her hands and stars sparkled in her eyes, which meant she understood that she could grow up quickly if she constantly went through a strong dungeon. He could not stand her good mood, he screamed, clenched his hands, and looked at him in fear. He pointed his finger at the girl and began to scold Jean. You can guarantee the life of a low-level hunter in a higher-ranking dungeon. She is mistaken. This is not really true. The girl leaned over, closed her eyes, and reminded her that such recklessness was the biggest risk factor for hunters. The girl felt strange. She felt like a child being scolded by an adult. But they were interrupted by the steps of a girl in red shoes. Coming closer, the girl in a red dress and with purple eyes touched her face. Watching the couple, she thought that they were lovers. Claire became embarrassed and raised her hands to her red cheeks, while Jean turned around, justifying himself by saying that he could not stand the stupid thoughts of these young ladies and decided to speak out. He turned completely to the woman, apologized if it was noisy. Claire's face glazed over. She was disappointed with his answer. The girl smiled, removing her hand from her face, finding the boy interesting, and asked if he was the hunter Jean. The boy was surprised, his mouth slightly open and his eyes wide open. He didn't understand why she knew him. People were making noise. They knew this girl. She was a mid-ranking hunter, Allison. She smiled again, forgot to introduce herself, raised her hand to her forehead, and reported that she was a member of the Hunters Association who was responsible for this promotion exam. He looked up into his eyes and asked evenly. Although he thought that from the association, the thought immediately flashed that something was fishy here. But he inquired about the matter with him. As she approached, the woman said that she had heard some interesting rumors. Jean, with his hands in his pocket, listened attentively. People started discussing that this child is a hero from rumors. It must be a mistake. They didn't believe it. The protagonist thought it was too much trouble and didn't want to be noticed in such places. Throwing up her hands, the girl noted that although this was unprecedented, she was thinking of giving him a step to immediately get promoted to a higher rank. She stopped and touched her finger to her mouth. If the rumors are true, then it's a very attractive offer for him now. Jean noticed that he was quite satisfied with his rank, and Claire's eyes sparkled with anticipation. The man's appearance caused surprise. He offered to be a rival, a completely unexpected offer. The same guy with whom the conflict occurred at the very beginning. He stood and held a spear in his hands. In order to pass the exam for a higher rank, he must fight with a hunter of a higher rank, so he suggested that they fight each other. He knew him, immediately flashed through his memories, opened his mouth, did not expect to see. It was the top-ranking hunter Ben, who didn't expect that he would be the hunter rumored to be there. The people around began to make noise. They knew him, and his power was very great. He was still just short of the highest rank. The girl in the red dress smiled, folding her hands. She thanked Ben for coming. The main character shouted. He didn't want to fight. Everything suited him. He immediately noticed that the spear had already slid past him and barely managed to turn away and grit his teeth. The guy slid down with the spear, crouched down and looked back at the bewildered man behind him. He laughed, grinned, and realized that he had dodged, which meant he had the necessary skills. The character shouted that this was too much of a test. He hadn't even agreed to take the exam yet, Ben said. He felt bad that he was already whining, although the real game had not yet begun. He turned around and looked at the guy. Or he thought that it was so easy to jump from rank to rank. The man became serious, his face darkening. He would never allow such an impudent newcomer to receive the highest rank. He warned that even if he died or became disabled during the exam, he should not be offended by him, and put his spear forward. The woman was pleased with herself. She understood that the man had higher skills, so she expected more from this massacre. Therefore, all that was left was to think about what he would do. Hunter Jean stood there, clenching his fists, and was clearly unhappy. He gave out what needed to be done to match his abilities. This question caught Ben off guard. The guy was talking to himself, so the man became confused, opened his mouth and frowned so that a wrinkle formed, squeezing his spear tighter. He confessed honestly when the man asked him what he was doing. Jean thought. Smiling, he finally replied that he was thinking about how to make him act like a human. Ben didn't like these words. He clenched his jaws so hard that they even creaked. He promised that he wouldn't let go. The guy stood and watched as the spear flew at him, not even moving as if he didn't feel fear. Suddenly he grabbed the spear with his hand, which caused confusion among all the people surrounding them. A smirk appeared on his face and he promised, his face darkening, that he would try to figure it out first. First he will beat him, and then he will think, clenching his hands into fists and looking openly. The boy cursed and looked with displeasure at Jean holding his weapon. The hunter grinned, looked with a dark face. The smile became sinister, and promised to show the difference personally. Jean towered over the unfortunate man. His face became huge and red. It haunted the boy and frightened him at the same time. He ran again, dust flying up from his sudden movements, and bounced away from his opponent. He didn't even understand what had happened. He sighed heavily, his chest heaving from the fear and shock he had experienced. The hunter praised the boy. His instincts were well developed. A smile appeared on his lips. The guy turned to Alexin. She stood there displeased, pursing her lips, and cursed again. He can't retreat. Not this time. Where the hunter is weaker than him, he saved his strength especially for this exam. There was no choice. Summoning his power, he became illuminated with a bluish light, strengthened his legs and arms, and his mouth twisted into a grimace. The girl raised her head, glad that Ben had finally decided to fight at full strength, and looked at the guy with hope. There was still a glimmer of hope that this guy wouldn't give her a ride. The boost lasts 5 minutes, he should make it in time. He shouted that now he would go full speed, but Jean extended his hand, and it immediately became quiet. Yellow surrounded the hunter. The relaxed figure of the man and his outstretched arm in an attempt to strike, called him a brat. Jean looked at him, and a flick was ready to fly out from under his hand. Beatings are the best medicine for him. A snap of his fingers and Ben flew to the side, a bump on his forehead that was filling with color. Oddly enough, the guy managed to stay on his feet, forced his legs to stop, but from the effort, sweat was pouring down his face. Gritting his teeth, he squinted, not understanding what had just happened and how the newcomer was able to strike so quickly. Jean was glad that this was not the end, and touched his forehead with his fingertips. And now the guy stopped. After the blow, Ben flew away with his mouth open so that drool flew to the sides. He fell and dust flew up to the sides. He looked around in dismay. He was disarmed so quickly and deftly. Folding his arms across his chest, he resolutely asked for a continuation. Jean did not feel any tension, as if he had gone out for a walk. He rose to his feet, raised his spear, gathering strength, never admitting his defeat. Jean exhaled. He expected that in front of him was a stubborn person who didn't even want to hear anything. Alexin came up and intervened, resting her hand on her side. The result was already clear to her. The guy shouted, not agreeing with her, not accepting the joke, not yet defeated, not wanting to believe in such a thing. She exhaled discontentedly, quietly, but audibly enough. She said that a person who only shows persistence is not attractive. The girl didn't like his words. She swung her leg and kicked Ben away, not listening to him until the end. Putting her leg out, she said, thus putting an end to the conversation. That it was worth leaving calmly, since everything had already been done. After this, Alexin turned to the hunter Jean, put her hands out in a gesture of admiration, jumped up to him, flattering words pouring out of her mouth. He asked in surprise, being a little in shock. He couldn't help but ask about his predetermined victory. Approaching him, she spoke about her standards for men, looked at him with an admiring gaze. Claire was shocked, watching what was happening. In the end, she invited me, holding my breath, into her laboratory, just the two of us, for a conversation. Jean agreed. He was eager to find out what the girl had in mind. She seduced him, touched his chin with her finger. Her whole pose expressed a predator. She touched her face and became embarrassed, while Claire's face darkened. She didn't like the idea of taking the guy away. Alexin walked ahead, apologizing to the guy for the dirt in her laboratory, and gently touched the flasks. She pointed to the refrigerator, turning to Jean. There are drinks in the refrigerator. You can help yourself. He sat down, already holding a drink in his hands, ready to listen, exhaled. Now about the main thing. She leaned her elbows on the table in front of him. She would not hesitate, and would immediately get down to business. She looked with violet eyes, stopping at the guy. The offer sounded unexpected, about joining the association. That's why Dan cried out in surprise, opened his eyes and mouth wide, and asked again if he had heard correctly. She touched his face and began to explain to the boy that people who are strong in association, and who think with their heads are always needed. But Jean still clarified that he was concerned about the reason for inviting a newcomer who had just moved up to the next rank. Raising her leg, the answer to the question of course exists. She looked at the boy with a smile. Turning to the table, she pulled off the white fabric with her hand. The boy stared at the equipment with interest. She gently touched the device, turned to the guy, had never seen anything like this before, and proudly declared that this was the very device for determining the level of the dungeon. Even Jean stood up, and Alexin continued that it was thanks to him that the Hunters Association had reached its current position. praising this device, naming its advantages. But after a short silence, she stated that it is not always accurate, and the guy himself knows this. He clarified in surprise that the association had known this moment from the very beginning. The main character was slowly starting to boil. She stood up for the fact that there is a small percentage of error, and it does not always occur. Hunters cannot know that the device can show errors, otherwise a riot will begin. Jean supported that hunters would be outraged by this, because their lives depend on their level, and not everyone wants to take risks. She touched the equipment and smiled. They don't need this. For the hunters to be reduced, this will lead to significant losses in all aspects. Then she turned her gaze back to the boy. The mistake was insignificant, and she stood her ground. Jean argued he was sure that people should know about this, because the hunters would be killed by stronger monsters. She turned up her nose. She believed that it was necessary to sacrifice a little for the sake of more. Jean's face darkened and he whispered rational murder, something new in his practice. The guys sitting there would have accepted this if they had sacrificed themselves, but not like this. They don't know about their fate. She gave in. The girl also rose up, quietly asked about his decision, as if her question could change his mind. Changing her position, she seductively clarified about the refusal of her offer with a smile, without showing sincere feelings, Alexin clarified. He asked to convey the words to the senior person in the association, not paying any attention to the girl's curves and gestures. He cursed and sent them all to hell, holding his cap and headed for the exit. Coming out of the building, clasping his hands. He now didn't know what to do. His face darkened. He exhaled that if Paul found out about the situation, he would be very angry, and immediately remembered his friend. He touched his cap in disappointment and exhaled when some man called out to him. He turned around, removing his hand in surprise, his face brightening when he saw the man who was calling the boy. He recognized the black-haired guy, turned his body towards him, and exhaled joyfully. The man with long hair was handing the report to the man. The man sitting at the table grinned. The report was about a newbie who cleared the dungeon almost single-handedly. An evil grin touched his lips. The glasses flashed, his face darkened. The guy remembered and threw out that this young man had defeated Ben and taken a higher rank. He held up a photograph of the hunter, repeated his name, asked himself a question, and immediately answered it. His face darkened, even his aura thickened and became entwined with bright red. A good name passed a verdict. Theo beamed with a smile, closed his eyes and announced the very same person who had already been on everyone's lips. The guys stood in front of the chief, waving their arms, and words flowed like a river about Jean, who completed the difficult test only 100, a good hunter. Paul, his face dark with anger, clasped his hands together and asked again about the celebrity. The hunter realized that the man sitting in front of him was upset. Then he turned to Paul, escorting him out of the office. He wanted to talk to the guy alone. Closing the door behind him, he smiled and said ingratiatingly that he would leave them then. Left alone, the hunter experienced the wrath of the chief and demanded an explanation of the whole situation. Paul said that he had fallen into a trap cleverly set by Alexin, and he asked again in surprise. This girl is as cunning as a fox, holds an important position in the association, and is a key figure. Praised her for her good foresight in recruiting a promising young hunter. It is understandable why they wanted to invite him to their organization, especially since his rank was raised. But if there had been a loss, then they would have gotten rid of him. Typical behavior of a girl. He continued his story that Jean refused, and thus Alexin's plan failed. Probably the girl was upset. He folded his arms across his chest. The hero laughed. She clearly underestimated him. He was confident in his abilities. He closed his eyes. He still didn't like it and didn't know what the girl was going to do next. So I looked at the guy and asked him to join his group. He cried out in dismay that he would not join any guilds, opened his eyes wide and even leaned forward. Paul didn't hear, asked him to think it over, but finally heard and cried out from the guy's answer. Enraged, he leaned forward. His hands fell on the table. It creaked pitifully, and he tried to bring it to his senses. He started talking about his guild, and that it was one of the top 5, and that the best solution would be to join them. Paul suddenly fell silent, looked from under his forehead at the elder standing in front of him, and did not understand the reason for the refusal. Now it was Jean's turn to shout that he was a great hunter, and could really stand up for himself. He would not fall for the association's tricks. The chief tried to argue that he had already fallen into a trap, but he fell silent and began to listen to the guy. He was simply softer with them. He lowered his head in sadness, closed his eyes, exhaled. He knew this young man, if he had made up his mind, then nothing and no one would change his mind. He sat back down in the chair, folded his hands in a prayerful gesture, asked him to be more careful. Jean assured him too hastily. There was no need to worry. Whistling, the hunter walked slowly out of the guild. People scurried about, merging into a black spot. The girl's shout, calling Jana by name, stopped, her back tensed. He turned to Claire, who was bent over exhausted, trying to catch her breath, her hands resting on her knees. After a while, she cheerfully showed off a green bracelet with a new letter, her face beaming with joy. The guy asked if he understood correctly. She straightened her back proudly and rested her hand on her side. She raised her rank. He smiled warmly, congratulated the girl. She blushed and looked down in embarrassment. But then she raised her head and warmly thanked the young man, all thanks to him. But he didn't understand why she followed him, and was a little confused when she was about to answer the question. She folded her hands behind her back, nervously fidgeted with them, became so embarrassed that her face turned red, and blurted out about gratitude and that she was looking for this only. Claire looked back, asked about joining Paul's guild, and tried not to look at Jean. Putting his hands in his pockets, he hastened to assure that he would not join any guild. He did not need it. The boy looked in that direction, trying to understand whether he had seen this man or whether he had met him for the first time. A man with long hair and glasses appeared before him, bowed, and introduced himself as Leon, a representative of the Northern Lights Guild. Jean asked again, threw up his hands in surprise. The man confirmed. The girl remained silent. He spoke pompously about his guild. They appreciated the hunter's skills and wanted to invite him to join them, waving his hand. I was sincerely surprised by the rank of the guild, the man confirmed smugly. He praised the group, asked the guy about joining. He was curious. He stared at him, but said nothing, only chuckled, but did not utter a word. He was assessing the situation. Jean's words discouraged the representative. He was not going to join anything. He fell silent in shock and opened his mouth, leaving in confusion, whistling. He continued to leave. A smile appeared on the lips of the hunter. He knew his worth. He blocked the boy's way. Leon shouted, suggested visiting their guild first and making a decision. He tried to persuade him too much, which was alarming. The clerk, who had been silent and listening until then, intervened. She was interested in the presentation of this organization. Having caught their interest, Leon began to advertise and invite people even more persistently to come and take a look. The girl squealed, jumping up and down as soon as she found out that the rank weapon would be free. It was very beneficial for her. The guy's distribution also made him wary. Jean wasn't interested, but the girl looked at him and stares shone in her eyes. He pressed his lips together, not wanting to fully understand what it meant, but a hand fell on his shoulder. She showed her thumb. The girl couldn't wait to go. Joy took hold of her. As we approached the guild building, the girl pointed her finger at people and kept saying that it was cooler and more crowded here. Jean exhaled with displeasure, noticing that he could look around, although he felt no joy, his gloomy face poorly concealing his apathy towards this guild. Claire didn't know which way to look. She took brochures. The boy didn't understand why she was dragging him along. She could have come alone. Turning around, I noticed that you can listen to the presentation and get a free weapon, which is also cool. Jean was suspicious of receiving such an item. Even though the girl had raised her level, she still couldn't pass by a free one. The girl snorted, considering him a skeptic, and didn't understand the guy's attitude at all, since a high-ranking guild wouldn't lie. She ran into the open door. The boy thought that she was naive after all. It seemed too suspicious. The assistant led them through the open door, let them in, entered, but stopped in a stupor from Claire. We walked a little forward, looking around. The room was empty. The girl whistled. Jean put his hands in his pockets, stepped forward a little, saw someone, stopped, letting them come closer to him. The same man with glasses stepped forward and greeted the couple there with a smile. The main character did not understand what was happening, so he stepped forward, blocking the girl's view, and shouted out his question. He looked around. He was surrounded by thugs with bats in their hands. They were gathering in a circle and slowly pushing him back. The glasses sparkled. He put his hand behind his back, cheerfully welcomed the entry into the guild. They were left with no choice. They were silent. The situation was getting tense. The crowd was getting closer, but the boy did nothing. The guy couldn't stand it and started to clarify the reason why they were simply pushing people here and forcing them to sign a contract. Leon laughed, pointed to the paper in his hands, just wanted him to make a decision. Jean did not agree. He tried to refuse. He wanted to see the reaction of what would follow next. Leon snapped his fingers as if giving an order, saying that it would be bad for everyone. The thugs closed in tighter around them, grinning and grinning, jokes flying. Lower your head, then he will have to explain why it is worth signing this document. Claire clutched her throat, not knowing what to do with it, stood behind the guy. There was a voice of agreement. The man raised his head and his glasses flashed. He scratched his head. He will join the guild. This statement caused surprise. No disputes or scandals. Leon chuckled. It was pretty easy, he thought. The boy gave in. A satisfied Leon handed over the paper for signature. All he had to do was put a tick, and that was it. The surprising thing is that there is a powerful curse on this form. Signing it will forever remain a loyal subordinate of the guild. The guy was discouraged. He wanted to meet with the master first. Having asked, he threw up his hands. In his opinion, he had the right to know the person of the master of the guild he was joining. A smile appeared on Leon's lips. He agreed to do it right now so that nothing else would interfere with the signing of the contract. The man stood and looked at the big city, his hand in his pocket. He was talking on the phone. He said something about how great his assistant was, and he would be there soon. He smiled, touched his lips. A grin appeared, squeezed the phone in his hand. He'll be there now. The man was the head of the guild, the Northern Lights, a top-ranking hunter, clutching the phone in his hands, and a smile lit up his face, thinking that the assistant had done well. At this time, Leon announced that the master would soon be here, and they remained to wait for his appearance. Claire looked back and saw that the guard was grinning, although his eyes were not visible from under his glasses, but the grin was clearly frightening. The girl lowered her head and apologized to Jean. It happened because she pulled it in, but the guy looked at her in surprise. He threw over his shoulder that she didn't need to apologize. He was the one needed anyway. The guy was the target. Claire leaned forward and exclaimed about the truth of his words about wanting to join the guild. And while waiting for an answer, she stopped and began to wait. The guy grinned. His eyes sparkled with cunning. He would take care of it. There was no need to worry from now on, no matter what happened. First of all, you should protect yourself. Claire accepted the man's words, promised him exactly that, clasped her hands and bowed her head behind his back. The boys were attracted by the laughter coming from the entrance, looked back at him and stared at the person entering. A tall, disheveled guy entered, joyfully opening his arms. He was pleased to meet me, and introduced himself as Colin, the head of the guild. He walked a little forward. The rest of his hunters bowed their heads in greeting, and he approached the guys closer and cheerfully invited them to his guild. Jean was skeptical, and was surprised that the head of the guild was in front of him, and Leon looked at him angrily. He cried out, gritting his teeth, that he needed to show respect to the master. His eyes narrowed, but the hand that reached out to him tried to stop his words. He fell silent and stared at the master in bewilderment. To this the chief remarked that everything was fine and he liked straightforward people, holding the man back with his hand. He touched Jean with his hand, patted him on the shoulder, shared that he had high hopes for him. The main character could not stand it, and shouted that all people were recruited this way and was dissatisfied with this method of recruitment. He dropped his hand, walked forward a little, and smugly noted that he was doing everything he could to ensure that the guild developed, as a result of which his guild now had more than 100 people, and was in 11th place. He continued that, unfortunately, they couldn't get any further because they didn't have any high-ranking hunters. If his guess was correct, then the guy standing in front of him had potential. He pointed his hand at Jean. That's why they use somewhat crude methods to recruit promising newcomers. With him, the Northern Lights can become even bigger. He continued to rant, praising his guild and saying that the guy would be well rewarded, and once again welcomed him into the guild. His face darkened, and without looking at the man, he said that this was all he wanted to say before his death. The head was surprised, and looked at him a little incomprehensibly, and behind him, Leon screamed, clenching his hands into fists. The guard came up from behind, put his hand on my shoulder. This young man is acting too arrogant. Jean turned around, grabbed his hand, and his eyes flashed with madness. He didn't like such willfulness. He abruptly struck him in the face with his fist, holding the hand that was on his shoulder with one hand. The man in the black suit fell to his knees. The hero towered over him. The others screamed in fear. Leon could not stand such impudence, and approached Jean, clenching his fists, and shouted what he was allowing himself to do. He started talking about how the guild, which ranks 11th in the country, resorts to forced recruitment of people. He said this, pointing his finger at the head. It was wrong, not fair to others. Still pointing his finger at the leader, he continued that they were just a gang of thugs posing as hunters. Leon gritted his teeth and spat out an insult, and how dare a newbie behave so brazenly. Using his power, he was about to teach a lesson in good manners. A chain of ice fell to the floor. Jean stared at the ice weapon that was beginning to bind him, his mouth slightly open. Seeing that he had caused harm, he screamed, opening his mouth so that saliva dripped. He would freeze him. Anger seethed. He could not contain it. But the guy deftly dodged the attack. He clenched his fists and seemed to increase in size. His legs repelled the ice. Surprised that the character handled the attack so deftly, Leon screamed, his mouth open in disbelief and beads of sweat running down his cheek. It was Jean's turn to rush into the attack. Spreading his arms out to the side, clenching his fists, he flew at him with a serious face. The assistant cursed. He was not careful. He tried to call for an ice blast, and his hand glowed blue. Jean got ahead of him, too late, and his fist was already raised in flames over the unfortunate man. Still with the same serious face, his fist fell into Leon's face. An explosion rang out and dust flew to the sides. The chief's assistant screamed in hellish pain. The lenses in his glasses cracked, and blood spurted. The main character towered over the defeated man, who was already lying on the floor. His glasses had slipped off and crumbled into tiny pieces. The leader concluded that despite the fact that hand-to-hand combat was not his main strength, Jean knocked down a high-ranking hunter with one blow. He muttered. Apparently, he was hiding his skills. He gave the order to attack him immediately, pointed his finger at the guy, and immediately the hunters took out their weapons. They surrounded the young man from all sides, and together they all pounced on him, assessing their strength and agility. Jean turned his head, dodging the ball, bending down so that only the sound of the fight could be heard in the large sports hall. He was not the last one left. He struck with his hands, jumped on their backs, held them with his legs, and thus defeated those people who surrounded him. He kicked, jumping into the air, spreading his arms and clenching his fists, his face distorted into a grimace. He sat down, touched the floor with his hand, and looked around, where the men were defeated, holding onto the parts of their bodies that hurt. The head of the guild pounced on the boy from behind, pulling out his dagger and gritting his teeth. The character was able to notice it and dodge it. The dagger slid with a burning fire and hit an empty space. He jumped away from him and looked at the man, who raised his sword to his lips, thinking about how to disarm him. As a result, the face distorted with a grin, he put on too much noise, quite applied the dragon's fiery fang. Approaching the guy who stood and did not move, the master said that it was better to give up hope of survival. Jean calmly noted that the man had a good sword and appreciated it. He smugly showed the dagger and shared that it was a legendary class weapon that he had received from a high-ranking dungeon, and his strength could not be compared to even the highest-ranking hunter. Unable to bear his praise, Jean said that he was always a fool who relied on other people's tools instead of striving for self-improvement. The young man didn't like this, and he screamed and rushed to attack the guy. The men began to dance. Jean deftly dodged the sword attack. Colin wanted to hit him even more. And the dagger hit the screaming protagonist, touched him with its fire, and it flared up like never before. But no matter how many blows he struck, no matter how good the weapon, how strong his subordinates, if he can't cope himself, then everything is useless. The man fell on his elbows. This provoked the master even more. He needed less chatter. He was already starting to freak out because the man standing in front of him remained calm. He crouched down and raised his sword, all the same calm actions measuredly. Without rushing, he taught the head a lesson. It was now that the strength of Jean and Colin collided. The steel sparkled as they touched each other. The master didn't understand how he could block his highest-ranking weapon with such a lousy ball, and he gritted his teeth. Then the character screamed, clenching his hand into a fist, and he really needed to be taught a good lesson. The guy flew at the unfortunate man, squeezing his fist tighter and tighter, turning it into a very powerful weapon. The guy cried out in surprise. He didn't understand what it meant to leave the guild. In front of him, a boy scratched his head with his hand, wondering what they should do if their best hunter leaves them. Colin recalled the time when he was filled with passion to create the best guild. But he could not leave those who left the weak guild, naively believing that once those who left understood the sincerity, they would return. And there were those who gloated when stronger ones left the weaker guild. The guy left Colin's guild and joined another one because he wants to become better and stronger. At some point, the master realized that if he wanted to become a big shot, he needed to play in the big leagues. That's when it all started. The dream he was chasing for them was just a dummy. Then he began to ruthlessly develop the guild, did not look at any feelings of the people he met, and tried to recruit hunters with potential, attracting them to that very devilish contract. Those who refused waved their hands and left, looking back at the head's assistants. He forced people to pay a very high price, and before he knew it, his once nameless guild had become the 11th ranked guild in the country. Now he was coming to his senses. Paul was looking at him with his dispassionate eyes. He asked fearfully who was standing in front of him, beads of sweat running down his face. The man introduced himself as Paul, the master of the Sonor Guild, and Colin, who was on the floor, cried out in surprise. Beads of sweat trickled down his face, wrinkles cut across his face. He did not understand why a representative of this guild was present here. Jean was also sitting on the floor, and behind him sat the hunters, the former male guards, with their heads bowed. He assumed that Jean was under the wing of the guild, and gritted his teeth from this unpleasant annoyance. The boy was outraged by this conclusion, jumped up and hit him in the face with his hand. The blow landed on his cheek. He continued to say that if he continued to talk nonsense, nothing good would happen to him, and he towered over him. Paul tried to explain that he seemed to have misunderstood, and Colin looked at him as if seeking support. The man explained that Hunter Jean was not a member of their guild, remaining serious until the very end of the conversation. I looked carefully, but still didn't understand why this man was here. His eyes turned into slits. He is his debtor, so he came to help. Jean scratched his head in surprise. For him, this also came as a complete surprise. Still lost in his thoughts, a boy turned to him. Colin stared at him with a question, frightened. Jana wanted to know the reason why the guys from the 11th rank guild acted like this, went so far. He admitted, hanging his head, that he simply wanted to create the best guild. People who strive to be the best and cheat never heard of this. That's why Jean looked surprised. Unable to bear the accusation, the leader shouted, knowing full well that this was wrong. But thanks to this method, they reached the 11th rank. Jean continued to press him and say that he had received the kind of guild that he dreamed, clenched his fists. The man began to understand little by little. He bowed his head, clenched his teeth. He didn't know what to answer to this question. A wrinkle ate away at his forehead, and his eyes were lowered. The realization of irreparability clouded him. He admitted that he didn't know what to do in the current system. The weak had no opportunity for a mid-ranking guild like him. It was the only way to gain power. He answered honestly that he would continue to do everything possible to develop the guild, shouting without holding back his emotions. This is the duty of the guildmaster. The people stirred. They were pleased by the master's care. They opened their mouths and looked at him with confidence that they would be with him until the very end. Didn't keep silent. Jean said that if the association's approach to the matter changed, the man in front of him would be able to change his thinking. But Colin bowed his head, considering it impossible. The stronger the large guilds become, the more attention the association has influence on them. He looked down at his hands, pressing them harder to the floor. That the association that occupies the pinnacle of power will never change its views. The words made me raise my head, surprised me, but the boy promised that he would make them change. He asked again in surprise, finally looking straight ahead without fear at the one who had defeated him. Paul couldn't resist asking again about the plan or something like that. He was also interested in the elder's words. The aura thickened, the boy's face darkened, and he began to blurt out words, talking about his plans. Then his hands grabbed the lock, rubbing them together. He began to say that he planned to create a force that would resist the association, and an ominous smile appeared on his face. Claire curiously put her hand and ear to the door, wondering what was going on inside. Jumping away from her, she began to talk to herself, learned that Paul was Master Sonar, and wondered who this boy was. She closed her eyes as if gathering her strength. She was interested in the guy, and wanted to know more about him. Theo appeared, scratched the back of his head in embarrassment, and admitted that he was also from this guild. The girl folded her arms across her chest, looked at the guy, and smiled slightly, praising him that he was more capable than he seemed. Before I had time to figure out what this meant, the door opened, and Jean came out. Behind him, clenching his fists, Paul came out. They looked at those who came out in surprise. The girl screamed and waved her hands. She began to squeal, causing everyone to stare at her in shock. Paul looked at this with displeasure and exhaled. He noticed a squabble where it became clear how he dared to talk like that to the head of the guild. Remembering what had just happened, he couldn't stand it. He was worried about what to do with them. The guy squinted and thought. When Jean called him, he looked at him in surprise, wondering what his old friend would do next. His eyes narrowed in anticipation of an answer. He turned back with a smile. Sometimes people only show themselves when they are given a chance. He lowered his head, stunned by this information. They looked at the guys who were sitting with their heads bowed and awaiting their fate. Perhaps he didn't have a chance, stood up for Colin and decided that they needed to give the others a chance. Smiling, the boy decided that since the leader was heading an 11th rank guild, he should have learned something. Paul lowered his head, exhaled, laughed, closing his eyes. He knew the elder for sure and that he had not changed. He was convinced of this personally. The muscles were bulging. The huge man was breathing heavily and lifting weights. This is his usual activity. He lowered himself to the floor, stood up and put his hands on his hips, exhaled deeply. Working out every day with sports equipment had toughened him up. He glanced sideways at the assistant who had announced the arrival of a visitor from the association. The master looked displeased. Rather than speaking, he growled, repeating where they came from. The aura thickened, turning red from the man's anger. The little man in glasses greeted the thug, who did not change his position and listened to the man who had come to him. He put his hands in his pockets, smiled sparingly, and introduced himself as Eugene, the head of the Hunters Association's violent crimes group. Scratching his ear with his finger, the head of the Bear Guild, Scott, did not listen to him very attentively. He raised his head, asked what they wanted from him. But he still didn't remove his hand, and stared at the guy in surprise. While exchanging words, Colin asked about the head of the Northern Lights Guild. Of course, the big guy knew him. Unable to bear it, he threw a weight at the leader, which fell with a terrible blow almost next to the man. Scott didn't understand why they suddenly mentioned this brat's name in his presence. It's better to answer, he warned right away, carefully. The leader then explained that Colin had been defeated by a lower-ranked hunter, which came as a complete surprise to the master. Angrily, he clarified, looked closely, narrowing his eyes, his forehead distorted with wrinkles. The manager grinned. It seemed he was interested. The lenses in his glasses sparkled with light. The man's mood changed. He smiled and said that he was ready to listen. Theo clenched his teeth, frowned, and a wrinkle darkened his white forehead. He stood in front of a huge purple monster with 2 heads, each head with 1 eye. He ran up, pulled out his sword, closed his eyes, clenched his teeth, and rushed to attack this monster. He tried to strike, but nothing worked. The sword slid off the monster's body as if from a stone. The monster let out a cry and opened its mouth, as if mocking the hunter. But then, gathering his strength, Theo jumped up and struck again, the sword rising above his head. The blow fell on the horn that was visible alone on his head. The man cried out. He jumped to the side, exhaled, leaned his hand on the ground, sweat dripped down his face, his forehead wrinkled. Jean put his hands on his hips and shouted at Theo, warning him, asking him to avoid difficult places when attacking. The guy turned away from him, shouted that he understood all this, exhaled air from his mouth forcefully, and got angry. The young hunter noted with displeasure, not understanding how he himself ended up in such a situation. The memories immediately reminded him of the moment when Theo pressed his hands to his chest, asked to be taken as a student, sincerely asked, desired it. Then the hero was confused. He did not understand why he needed a student. But the young man's persistence discouraged him. He admitted that he had been thinking about this for a long time. Wanted to follow in the footsteps of the hunter Jean and become a stronger hunter. A smile lit up his face. A blush appeared on his cheeks. He raised his hand to his head, scratched it, and asked himself a couple of questions about the guild and the mentor. Even more embarrassed, the boy admitted that the master was always busy with guild affairs, and he asked to convey that he trusted Jean and that he should be under his care. The hero's face darkened, and he immediately remembered Paul. In the end, Jean agreed he would help with training for a while. He opened his arms for a hug. The boy cried out joyfully. And now Theo, his face gloomy, exhaled, frowning, screamed, but attacked this monster. When a creature with 2 heads fell behind him, he pulled out his sword and exhaled. He had succeeded. He had coped. Jean praised him. He had definitely improved his skills since last time. The boy was pleased that the master had noticed this. If this continues, he will have a good chance of achieving the highest rank in the next exam, the master said, waving his hands in an excess of emotion. He promised that he would work even harder. He made this decision. It was the right one. People were indignant. They looked at the guys and said that they were being too self-important. They did all the work, and the so-called leader just stood and watched. The young people who were talking among themselves noticed that they were being discussed, looked away, and were attracted by the words that in fact Jean was not that strong. He was just very lucky. Theo was outraged by these words. He moved forward shouting that the master was not like that. But Jean stopped him, exhaled, put his hand on his shoulder, ending the conversation. The boy was left to watch as the teacher left, saying that fools only care what others think. They had cleared the dungeon, so they now needed to go to the exit. The student was completely immersed in thought and did not notice how some man, whose face was not visible, was watching them from the side. Already at the base, when they entered inside, they happily informed everyone that they had done a great job and could now go home. Jean, as always in his favorite manner, put his hands in his pockets and headed out. Already on the street, a young man called out to him and turned over his shoulder to look at him. A young man with dark hair and a pitiful look asked the elder whether the words of those people about him rising from a lower rank to a higher one were true. Jean did not answer the question directly, but turned around and clarified the reason for the interest. Without holding back his emotions, the boy stepped forward. He wanted to become his student, to become just as strong. Jean was confused and asked again. Theo appeared and also showed curiosity about what was going on here. The main character was indignant. Who does he think he is and wants him to take him as his student? The guy was confused and began to stutter. He could not pronounce the words. Then he waved his hand at him and said that if he had nothing to say, let him go look for someone else. The boy scratched his head and lowered his eyes to the floor. Without leaving, the character asked if he really wanted to become his student. Why did he give up so easily? He was curious and interested in what this young man was like. The boy bleated in a plaintive voice that he understood why he didn't want to take a person like him as an apprentice. Jean got bored during the conversation. He was already tired. He apologized again. The boy did not know how to attract attention so that he would notice the potential in him. Then Theo intervened. He asked to be accepted as a student, to be given the opportunity to become stronger and better. The clouds were gathering behind the boy. Since he came and asked, apparently there was something behind it. And Theo admitted that it would be better for him to have a partner for training. Jean looked at him. He said that learning depends not only on the teacher, but also on the student's attitude. and shouted that he cannot teach someone who has no desire or motivation. The young man, who had been silent until then, shouted that he had motivation, put his hand to his chest, and could not contain his emotions. Jean thought for a long time. The aura grew darker, became darker, showing its strength, building up. Theo couldn't resist asking him about it too. Looked over his shoulder at his student, listened to him. He didn't understand the reason why he wanted to help him so much. In principle, it didn't matter. But he didn't see any motivation in the boy. So his defense against Theo was extremely curious. The student suddenly straightened up, put his hand to his chest, kicked his foot and fell silent, closing his eyes. Finally, he shouted loudly that he who gives a chance to those who seek returned the words of the elder. This is the spirit of his guild. These words the head repeats every time. He folded his hands in a prayerful gesture. His face lit up with a smile. He began to ask Jean, who gritted his teeth, already making a decision in favor of the assistant. He turned to the boy, who had been standing and listening silently until then, and allowed him to join the next raid. He was delighted. A smile appeared, and he cried out that he would try to do everything possible and impossible. A smile touched his lips. His face changed. Then the boy introduced himself. His name was Leon. Coming closer, Jean introduced himself, also asked that they try together, joyfully clenched his fist and shouted out agreement. Theo also did not stand aside, introduced himself and said that since they would be training together, they could talk to him freely. The boy bowed down, no longer straining, already smiling joyfully. He was sincerely glad to meet everyone. Jean exhaled and heard Theo asking to be called Big Brother. A few days after all this, Jean opened his mouth in surprise. A drop of sweat rolled down his cheek and stared at something to the side. The boy turned his pitiful face towards him and exhaled. His whole posture, his whole facial expression showed weakness. Tears were already shining in his eyes. The youth stood in front of a monster that was several times taller than him, sharp horns and sharp fangs in its mouth. The guy did not notice this. He turned his head and looked at his teacher. Jean intercepted him in time and pushed him to the side, and the fists of the angry creature fell on the place where the boy stood. He sat down to the side. Knives were lying nearby. He thanked, turned his head. The hunter's back trembled with anger, his teeth gritted. Jumping up, pointing his finger at him, he shouted that he was out of his mind. His anger was seething and looking for a way out. The boy could not cope with an easy task for the umpteenth time. He only just exhaled an apology. His face darkened. He really didn't want to do any of this and regretted that he was such a weakling. But the main character got even more heated. He screamed, and did not understand how this boy had even received any rank. The master always demanded to check the weapon before the attack. Theo tried to calm him down, and held him with his hand. He clenched his fists, straightened up, lowered his eyes. He was very sorry. He apologized. The fury of the cat and Jean. He could barely contain himself. He hit himself on the head, exhaled, closed his eyes. He didn't know what to do with it. He lowered his head. Tears flowed from his eyes along with beads of sweat. He himself did not know why he was such a weak hunter. And here again the boy stood in front of a stone monster whose only eye was glowing red. He called upon his weapon-enhancing power, and the sword in the boy's hand sparkled blue. He swung and hit the very center. He tried, but once again he miscalculated his blow. He stopped, raised his head, looked at the monster. Now the eye was no longer glowing red, but a dull blue. But then he raised his huge stone hand, clenched into a fist, towards the boy. Jean arrived in time, cut the fist with his sharp ball, and one part fell off from the other. The main character's face changed. He screamed with his mouth open and his eyes wide open. When he landed on the ground, Leon stood with his sharp ball and thanked the person who came up for his help. He reminded me that he had already said more than once that you shouldn't rely too much on your skills during an attack, and had repeated many times that this wasn't just a reckless attack. You had to calmly target weak spots. He stuck his chest out. Jean pressed his hand to his chest. This boy, was driving him crazy. His eyes lit up white with anger. He turned around sharply, clenching his hands into fists and gritting his teeth. He left. Leon looked with his head bowed and regretting his situation. Tears filled his eyes and were already running down his cheeks. He was speechless. He looked down and pursed his lips. He encouraged the boy with a smile. There was no need to worry. He would succeed next time. He looked back at Theo. Then he turned around abruptly and was about to leave. He needed to cool down a bit alone, Leon said quietly. Theo tried to call him, but the boy was already resolutely walking towards him. The man looked after him, closed his eyes and exhaled. He felt very sorry for the boy, but he couldn't help with anything. The hand, clenched into a fist, suddenly fell on the stone, causing a cracking sound. Leon cursed, touched his fist with his forehead, and a bead of sweat ran down his cheek. He whispered into the stone wall how much longer he had to endure this attitude. He pressed himself against the wall with anger, his back tense, and then he decided to leave. But he corrected himself, burying his face even more deeply, pressing himself against the hand. He stopped himself, asking, persuading himself to be patient a little longer. Gritting his teeth until they hurt, his eyes filled as if with sand. He couldn't give up so easily. The boy was shouted at. The people were about to leave. He looked over his shoulder and now he will go with them too. And then he ran towards them, picking up speed, as if all this had just happened to someone else. He leaned back in his chair and exhaled exhaustedly. This was too tiring, hard work for no clear reason. Paul propped his cheek up with his hand. He didn't understand either. He closed his eyes. He was tired of all this. He asked, without removing his hand from his face, "What makes people come to their guild?" Jean exhaled. Where else could an old man go without connections? One part of his friends was on the threshold of death. The other had long since crossed the line. If the guy is going to keep coming here, then he should join them. With his arms outstretched, he wants to feel free, which won't happen if the hero joins the organization. I noticed with displeasure that the association was causing concern, because it remained calm even after the incident with the Northern Lights. His face darkened. He folded his hands under his chin. Paul said that there were rumors about his special position. A smile appeared on Jean's lips, because it was really the man who started it. They were close, that was true. But the man interrupted. They were not close in the same way. The character looked at him in surprise, still not understanding. He shared that there is a rumor that the guy is the main one's lover. He jumped up from his chair, shouted, throwing his arms out to the side. Who could spread such absurd rumors? The members of Paul's guild are very unhappy with the fact that the leader cares more about outsiders, which is the reason for the appearance of absurd rumors. He sat back down, gave the man an ultimatum. Either he doesn't visit them or he joins in, and chuckled. He came to the disappointing conclusion that old people were not welcome here. Paul got angry and tried to justify himself, which had nothing to do with his age. He got up and headed for the exit. Everything was clear to him. Absolutely everything. The guy put his hands in his pockets. He won't be coming here for a while, but now it's time for him to go. Paul called out. Jean looked at him without turning around, expectantly. He raised his hand and said that the Bear Guild was digging into his past. He turned around and asked about this guild. Like those idiots from the north, the man became curious. Paul told me about this guild, that they occupy 10th place. But unlike everyone else, the leader has such a bad reputation that they never know what he will do. Jean chuckled. He said several times that there was no need to worry about him, because he was a great hunter. He turned to the door, waved his hand and said goodbye to Paul. He was now setting sail. He exhaled as he watched the elder leave, he remembered, but was still worried. Jean looked around the place with concern and asked if there was anyone there. Pa confirmed, standing around the man and listening attentively to their teacher. Theo asked why he had called them here so urgently, and even suggested the appearance of a dangerous dungeon. Leon bowed his head, tears were in his eyes again, and he pursed his lips sadly. Jean was glad that this was not a training session. The boys looked at each other, a little scared, wondering what the teacher had prepared for them. He replied that today he thought they could do some team-building exercises, and he lowered his head sadly. His gaze grew heavy when he heard that there was nothing special. They would just spend time together to strengthen the spirit of camaraderie. He was clearly unhappy with this idea. Jean said with a smile that today he would like to take advantage of this opportunity to establish some internal connections. Even though he took them all as students, he knows little about them. Sometimes a break helps to unite. Theo scratched his face. Leon lowered his hands down and clenched his fists. Then he scratched his head. The guy asked what exactly they would do today. Jean nodded his head. He hadn't thought about it yet, but he'll think of something and take a look, that's for sure. I asked them what young people do now when they want to relax. The guys looked at each other thoughtfully and stared at each other. Theo said thoughtfully that he usually plays or goes to the mountains, closing his eyes. Jean laughed and touched his chin with his hand. Young people still have fun like that. Leon extended his hand, complimented his partner's unusual hobby, but he was getting bored with it. Jean got angry, screamed that something was wrong with the game, attacked Leon. This was too deep a game. Apologized in fear, confused by such pressure. Having calmed down, he folded his arms across his chest and moved away a little. I asked him what he was doing. The boy became confused and began to stutter. He couldn't find what to answer. Tears glistened in his eyes again. He began to speak, stuttering, but never finished his speech. Jean sat down on the soft sofa with a book in his hands. He felt very comfortable and cozy. Leon brought them to the bookstore. This is how he usually spends his time, and he scratched his head awkwardly. The three of them sat on soft sofas, each holding a book in their hands. Jean chuckled, buried his face in the book, and looked at Leon with longing. as if he wanted to say something but couldn't. The guy looked at him for a long time and intently, his lips pressed together and his eyes sad. He was hiding too much about himself. The young man cringed at the question, asked Leon why he became a hunter, leaned forward. The guy didn't even know what to answer. The boy had liked comics since he was a child, and a smile touched his always pursed lips. So when the hunters first appeared, he was delighted the hunters were from the words of heroes from comics. The boy admitted, looking down, that he too decided to become a hunter, because one day, he wanted to live as cool as the heroes. Jean repeated the boy's words about the heroes. Looking at the book, the boy raised his head, scratched the back of his head, and smiled too childishly. But when Jean denied it, his attentive gaze stopped on the teacher. He did not expect that he would support him in these dreams. He smiled, sincerely not understanding what was wrong with a guy who carried such a romantic dream in his heart. It seemed to him that this was a truly wonderful dream. Leon blossomed. The fear disappeared from his eyes and he looked at him with admiration without taking his eyes off him. Claire watched Jean read. She exhaled, awkwardly moving closer. Carefully clenching her hand into a fist, she called him by name and the boy looked back. The girl, darker than a cloud, buried her face in a book, hiding her face from everyone. She put the comic away, let out a long sigh, not understanding what she was doing now. She stopped herself, because the guy is not that handsome. But her thoughts constantly returned to him, and she blushed sharply. I didn't argue. Dan was cool during the raid. I wondered when and how I fell in love with such a guy. She touched her chin with her hand. The guy gave off a feeling of nostalgia, reminding me of my grandfather from my childhood. Jenny said that she was going to the toilet, got up, but her thoughts still returned to the one who stole the girl's heart. She admitted to herself that she missed him very much. Her face was burning with heat. Walking a little forward, she saw the one who was currently occupying the girl's thoughts. She didn't believe what she saw, but it was indeed Jean. Jean chuckled, glanced sideways at the one who called him, and was no less surprised. A couple of minutes were enough to understand that he saw a familiar person. Jean extended his hand in greeting, considering it a coincidence that he met her here and called the girl by name. She was surprised and blushed a little, opened her eyes wide but showed curiosity, and asked what he was doing there. Jean answered, not hiding that he was here to get closer to his friends. The girl looked at the guys. Leon blushed, but asked the teacher about the relationship with this beautiful ice. The girl now glanced sideways at him, blushed even more. The boy's next question made Claire look down, and she felt awkward raising her head, the blush coloring her cheeks even more. Now they were burning. She nervously fiddled with her hands and muttered that this was nonsense, but Jean remained silent. He folded his arms across his chest with displeasure, and noted that she was just his friend, which made the girl even more embarrassed. Leon didn't lose his head, and awkwardly scratching his head, introduced himself to the girl, looking at her cheerfully. She had no desire to get to know him, especially after Jean's words, so she folded her arms across her chest, as if closing herself off from him. Jenny approached Claire, looked at the guys with interest, hurried the girl, but noticed Jean. Noticing the girl with purple hair, the hero greeted her cheerfully. Jenny hurried Claire, held out her hand. It was time for them to leave. She glanced sideways at her. Jean waved his hand. He understood that the girls were in a hurry. Then they would be able to see each other another time. No big deal. The girl was experiencing strange feelings. Now she was so sad and melancholy about parting with him. She didn't want to leave, so she called out to the guy. He looked at them for a long time, not understanding what the girl wanted. She stepped forward and suggested going to karaoke with them. They were going right now, and could go with a big group. But Jean was too impenetrable. He pointed to the book and said that he was halfway through the comic, but smiled warmly. Here Leon intervened, shouting that he wanted to go to karaoke because that was the very essence of youth. Even the boy jumped up. Tell was silent and only nodded, sitting as if stunned by Leon's activity. The man looked around the room. It had been too long since he had been to karaoke, while everyone was taking their seats. Claire's face darkened. She didn't understand why she suggested going to karaoke. She suggested that Jean sing together. She wanted to get closer to him, but he muttered discontentedly that he was hearing the song for the first time. Leon immediately jumped up, offering to help. With tears in her eyes, Claire sang a song together, not quite what she wanted. But hearing that Jean was going to sing something too, she screamed, pressed too hard and drew attention to herself. Sympathy was immediately noticeable. The young man began to sing, clutching the microphone tightly, closing his eyes and putting a piece of his soul into the song. Claire's face darkened as she returned to the table. She didn't understand. She didn't like the guy's choice. Jenny asked the girl in a whisper so that no one could hear. She asked the question directly, causing her to blush and widen her eyes, and even to breathe every other time. The girl knew that Claire had a crush on Jean. Her hands flew up to her cheeks. The girl screamed. It was all so obvious. Jenny nodded her head. She lowered her head, apologized to her friend, dragged her without any particular reason, but the girl saw that the guy didn't like her, so she decided to give in. Jenny supported her, showed her a thumbs up, will always be on the side of their relationship. The girl felt pleased. Theo praised the teacher. In fact, he sang very well. Dan blushed, admitted that when he was younger everyone predicted that he would have a career as a singer. Jenny drew attention to herself by praising the character by name. She started telling me that Claire had lost her wallet at the comic book store, and that she needed to go with her and look for it. But while John was thinking, Leon volunteered to help and jumped up again, showing activity. She quietly moved the table towards the guy. He screamed from the pain in his knee, and she continued as if nothing had happened with her question again. The character chuckled and grimaced with displeasure, as if guessing what this was all for. After some thought, she heard consent. Claire blushed, was confused and could not find an answer, stuttering and muttering gratitude. Leon looked at the girls with the gaze of a beaten dog. His sad look and the blush on his cheeks betrayed his disappointment. Once inside the store, Claire thanked Jean for helping her find her wallet. As soon as they started talking about returning, the girl cried out. She didn't want to part so soon. Claire's face darkened as she thought hard about what else she could do, since Jenny had created the situation so that they would get closer. In the end, I couldn't find anything better to ask about sympathy. Jean was surprised by such a question. He said that he liked a person in the past. Then Claire asked if anything had happened to him. The girl opened her eyes in surprise. As soon as she heard that her beloved had died, she could not move or utter a word. She waved her hands. She shouldn't have asked. She was so nervous that her legs started shaking. Even though Jean assured me that it was all in the past, she was eating herself up from the inside with guilt, and the guy was already whistling on the sidelines and thinking about his granny, who had left this world. I asked, looked at her. What was the reason for such a question? Apparently it was because of Leon, I decided. Now it was Claire's turn to be surprised. She didn't understand what that boy had to do with it. She stared at him, waiting for an explanation. It just seemed to the hero that Leon liked her, she screamed. She didn't like this at all. She screamed, clenching her fists. She already has the one she likes. She closed her eyes. Jean smiled, apologized. He didn't know about it. Asked if maybe he knew him by chance. Her face darkened and she tried to force the words out of herself, but she couldn't, and fell silent, as if she was afraid of something. She turned around and hurried away, saying as she went that it was very urgent and that she would return, covering her face with her hands. I didn't understand. I looked and didn't know how to understand young people in the present day. There were two people left at the karaoke table, Jenny and Theo, and they were feeling awkward. Unable to bear it, the girl grumbled indignantly that they were not in a hurry. The guy smiled, touched his hair, agreeing with her. And Leon went to the toilet and was gone for a long time, which also seemed rather strange to the man. So they sat there together, feeling awkward. Jenny thought that everyone would come soon. The girl thought about it, worried about her friend, hoped that everything was fine with her, and raised her head. Claire was amazed when she saw Leon on her way to the toilet. The guy stood in front of her, his head down and not daring to raise his eyes, awkward and feeling guilty. He couldn't even find the words. The boy's cheeks turned red, and Claire thought that Jean was right about the young man's sympathy. She felt a sense of excitement, noticed how he closed his eyes and blushed even more, and breathed out her name. He apologized. Claire's mouth opened in surprise. Her body trembled intuitively. Behind her towered a figure that exuded danger. She turned around, looked back, and the scream drowned in her throat. She couldn't even utter a word out of fear. Silent Leon lowered his head. His face turned black, making a guttural sound. The girl fell silent. Now only he knows what happened to her.